Okay, welcome. I am double checking that, right, everything is working properly, the recording. By the way, last class I taught this afternoon,
I
I
was
know
looking
I hit the record button because I focused on it, but I must not hit it hard enough. It didn't
me
record.
neither.
This
Actually,
lecture is recording, correct?
oh,
Anybody
oh,
care to just quick check in
Yes.
your, yeah, thank you very much.
mhm.
Because that means that the lecture, it's very valuable tonight. We're going to cover the 9 elements of composition, which you'll need to know how to use for your papers. And I'll answer all your questions. It's the first half. Now, after the break, we'll get to the prehistoric slides of prehistoric art. Um, but because of the fact that the class in the afternoon is a different, 1.2, it's Renaissance to Impressionism, but they didn't get they if they miss that lecture live, they won't be able to see the recording of it. So I've invited them to look, not join this class, but just look at the YouTube. Of course, anyone can go to YouTube, right, and see this recording. So why I brought that up, excellent questions from all the classes I've ever taught on Zoom when it came to this lecture. So please feel free to ask me any questions at any point as they come up during the 9 elements. Now, you should all have those handouts. I did send them out. A couple people said they couldn't get them. I don't know why, but I've resent those people if they asked me to on markw at AOL. It's very difficult to send attachments on the Outlook email, much more cumbersome. So if you need the attachments after this, there will still be a couple more handouts. Please always ask me on my markw at AOL. But before we get to that, let's see, do we have, yeah, another person to admit? Good. Before we get to the 9 elements of composition tonight, okay, I am going to mention, this is important too, that I have only received 12 people's mini bios from this section. So that's a concern because let's see, is there anybody else? See, hang on. Yeah, one more person. Speaking of which, I'm going to go ahead and this is what I'm doing. I'm trying to save time. Since more people didn't yet out of the total enrollment of 30, less than half I've received those mini bios from. I need the others whose names I won't be calling because I didn't get them. So if you hear your name, you're good. And if you don't, then figure you need to maybe send it to the wrong, I don't know, could have happened to the wrong email or could have bought, I don't see why it'd be spammed out, but who knows? Doesn't matter what the reasons are. I still need it from you. And of course, I'll send you an email to remind you of that on Tuesday, all my classes, that I need them by the end of this week. Okay, here are the people I did get many bios from. I will do this quickly and then we'll shift into tonight's topics. Okay, McKenna Andrade, Tristan Cabrera, I know you just joined us, right? Madeline Cook, Sophie Gospi, I think that's right, right? And then Kayla Konopa, Sarah Loken, Daniel Perez, Christian Ricci, right? Elijah Schwartz, Michael Wendrick, Ying Zhong, and Rob Anderson. If you didn't hear your name, it doesn't matter the reason. It just means I don't have a record of your mini bio. And of course, it's important for me to know more about each of you that are now joining or haven't yet sent me your mini bios. Remember what they cover. They cover, in case you joined the class late, 3 things. Keep it brief, half a page at most. And those would be first is your work and educational experiences. The highlights, not, if you, whatever educational level you've attained and the major jobs you've held. Second, okay, here we go. The second thing on your mini bios, in case you've forgotten or didn't hear that, is where have you traveled and lived outside of Northern California? And then lastly, what do you want to learn from this class? Pretty simple. Keep it to, max a couple of paragraphs, maybe 3 short paragraphs. Okay, so please, if you didn't hear your name in that last batch, then you need to send me those. Okay, let's do something, a quick aside. I think you're going to find this interesting. I'm going to go ahead and do the speaker view so you guys can see what I'm about to show you. I went to the Immersive Van Gogh exhibit on Sunday with a friend who actually studied art history about the same time I did. Obviously, therefore, from my generation. And she was a graphic designer at major San Francisco design firms. So she really knows her graphics, even though, yes, that's before computer graphics were common, but she joined the computer age. She's much more tech savvy than I had been up until recently. So it was interesting to see it with her because we could kind of evaluate it as art historian and a graphic artist. It's called Immersive Van Gogh. I bet some of you have heard of it. Let me ask, has anybody been to it? It's in San Francisco and it's gotten rave reviews. So I can tell you, you'll find it worth your time if you go. And it's not cheap. It's more than expensive. I'm sorry, Matt, more expensive than a museum. The basic, it's all you need. You don't need, I made the mistake of spending the extra 19 or 20 bucks thinking that would get me a lot of extra things. You don't need that. They provide seating and everything is the same in the show. It lasts only 40 minutes. So if you enjoy it as much as I and my friend did, we stayed and watched it a second time because there's so much stuff happening in the room, on the walls, right? It's immersive sound and light show with almost every major famous image of Van Gogh's brought to life is how I would describe it. And great music background, no dialogue. So you just washed over with these images of his magnificent art, of course. So even though we're not covering Van Gogh in this class, you get 10 points extra credit. I qualify that as a museum visit. And it's immersive, IMM, right? Immersive Van Gogh. And they're in multiple cities they're doing this. But the San Francisco one has gotten the best reviews. The facility is quite nice. The staff was helpful, excellent, professional. It was a really great experience. And it's there till, I think, the last weekend in September. But if you pay the higher price, you'll get one of these. A Van Gogh cushion with his sunflower on it. And one of two posters. I chose the red self-portrait because my father, who was a commercial artist, had this on his wall for a number of years. He had a print of it, not the poster, of course. Well, maybe it was a poster. I can't remember. I won't show it the whole thing. It's huge. I don't think it's worth the extra 20 bucks. Save the difference. The $49.95 one is adequate. And then you can, stick around if you enjoyed it for a second viewing of this. I found it well worth the time. And parking on a Sunday, that's right. It's free on in the meters in that area of San Francisco. There are plenty of meters. It's on Van Ness, just south of Market Street. Okay, enough about that for now. So let's now get out. Everyone should have your 9 elements of composition because we're going to go over those together. And you can tell maybe some of you, I'm coming from you tonight from a different wall or side of my Berkeley bedroom. What's behind me there is a whiteboard we're going to use to illustrate some of these elements. And yes, this is my own artwork. As my father used to say, I think I mentioned already, he was a professional artist, commercial artist. He supported family on his artwork. So he was pretty good at it. He'd call that kind of artwork, that one I just did, you're going to see now, a Mickey Mouse artwork. It's not going to be great quality, but it's going to get across the points. Yes, stick figures, you can see some of it already. But I'm going to do some proactive stuff on this whiteboard. And you will be able, as we go through each element, not only to see those that are susceptible to a simple illustrative example. I give you the definition, which is already printed out, or should be, on your 9 elements handle. So I have that next to you. You could always add, of course, examples or comments, whatever, in the margin or on your own separate note page. But at the end of each of the 9 elements, I will pause and say, are there any questions? And by the time we get to the point is the end of the first half, before the break, you should be pretty clear on how to use these elements because you will need to know how to incorporate them into your papers. Next week, we will have another handout plus a PDF of a previous A paper from one of my students who authorized me to use that paper a few years ago. And it'll give you a concrete idea of what to expect if you want an A or a good grade on your papers. And we'll also go over that together. So then you'll have 3 more weeks after that before the paper's due. So you'll have plenty of time to think about what you want to write. I think everyone knows this, but in my afternoon class, I still had 2 or 3 students say, do we have to write about something on the syllabus? No, you could write about any work of art, any visual art from any period, any style, any artist, as long as you can find some research on it. Okay. Oh, okay. Yes, you know what? Thank you, Levi. I saw your email and I was going to mark you down as having, but you must be under a different name. This causes problems all the time. The way the records of missions people do things, they don't always match up with your actual preferred name. So can you give me what might be an alternative spelling or listing for your name, Levi? Because it's not on my roster. I know you're in the class, obviously, or you couldn't join us. And I will give you credit for having signed in. I'll just write your name at the bottom if I can't find it. You see what I'm asking, Levi? Just to keep it quick. Um, oh, what should the title be? Mini bio. MINIBIO. Yeah, that's, and don't forget the class, please. Your full name as you registered it. So you see how that comes up now. And I know I'm taking a moment to sidebar here with Levi. You hear me? Because I see. There you are. Thank you. Thank you. Yep, got you. Now you're all logged in. There, that was quick. So that can happen. So in your papers, especially, it's going to be even more important because it's worth 100 points or your exams. Try to remember how you should have a copy of what your name was entered in and the Office of Records of Admissions, just like at Starbucks. That's not exactly the same, but you all know they can't spell most people's first names. How many ways are there to spell my daughter's name? Elena. I mean, Elena. What other ways are there? Oh, there's about a dozen. And then, if it's in this class and that happens, I might not know who it is that you are. Your name doesn't match with something on my roster. So try to remember to put in the email handle and the label. I will repeat this because it's weeks from now before the first papers due. The name you have on your registration listing when you enrolled in the class. And some of you have different emails totally than what your name is because they're your families or something. That will really cause confusion if you don't remember to do what I just said. So let's move on. Okay, let's go over these 9 elements because as we go, they get a little more complex, and we'll save the most complex for the last few. So let's start out with we'll start out with balance. And the reason I start out that way, even though I hope this isn't a problem for people, I vary the order sometimes, and you can too on your papers. You don't have to follow the exact order of this handout. However, this is just a suggestion, a word to the wise. It'd be a good idea to have this handout next to you when you're actually working on your paper and before you finish and turn it in or email it in to me, because it's like a checklist and you can see, did I forget one of these or more than one of these elements, which each one would lower your grade a bit. So that's one other reason to have that handout. Okay, let's talk about balance. I will read you the definitions first. I'm not going to read them off that board because the point of the board is things that aren't on the handout, which covers the minimal definition for each term. Then if there's some illustration to go with it, I will turn to the board. And I hope, last period I was able to just lean in without lapping the screen so you can see everything as I discuss it. Okay, let's go do balance first. I know it's number 2 on the handout, but we're starting on this blackboard or whiteboard with that. How do you know if something's balanced when you're analyzing a work of art? Okay, you ask yourself, are there equal or roughly equal areas of objects from top to bottom and from left to right in a work of art? If there are, you could say roughly or nearly equal numbers or areas covered by the various parts of a work of art. And in this, I'm keeping it really simple. In this example, we're looking at, let's say it's a drawing, right, of jellyfish. You make up your mind. If you think they look like comets, that's fine. But anyway, let's say they're jellyfish and someone's doing a, illustration of them, a line drawing. Okay, how would you know if that illustration is balanced? If you were to write about it, there's really only one way to do it consistently, and I'm going to use a handy prop here. One of my wife's many paintbrushes from her painting projects, and it will work as a pointer. Okay, so how do you do that? How do you analyze if something is balanced, left to right and top to bottom? Well, first you put a border around it. Of course, you can't do that if it's, in a building, a museum, you get arrested. So if it's in a museum and it's a painting or it's a photo from a museum, of course, that's what you'll be probably working with on your papers. If you write about a painting, you almost already have the border given because it's the frame. So, but if it doesn't have a border, imagine in your mind a border around the outer edges. And whatever shape that is square or rectangular, the main point is that then you divide that frame into 4 equal parts. It's called quadrants, right? And then this is how you decide if this image, this work of art, is or is not balanced. You look at how many, let's look at top to bottom first, okay? Everybody sees that I'm not in the way, I hope, yeah, right. And how many jellyfish or slash comets are there here on the top half? Well, let's see, 1, 2, 3, right? How about below the median, the bottom half? Again, 1, 2, 3. So would you write, if you were writing about this, would you say that this work of art, this drawing, whatever, is roughly balanced top to bottom? Anybody can speak up, right? From what I just told you, would you say that this is balanced top to bottom? Yes, yeah, you get the idea, I think. I'm going to do some alterations so it'll become a little less obvious. How about left to right? Well, for the same reason, you've got 1, 2, 3, right? Jellyfish, we'll say, on the right left half, and obviously the same number on the right. So they don't have to be exactly the same size. I mean, rarely do works of art have exact symmetry, which means exactly the same left to right and top to bottom. That's called, left to right is bilateral symmetry. Some artwork does, but usually it's a rough balance in terms of the number of objects or people, whatever they are, in the painting. And I give you total flexibility about if you see something that's not really clearly one way or the other. If it looks more balanced than unbalanced to you, I would accept that, as long as you explain in a sentence why you think it's more balanced than unbalanced. Okay, so this clearly is roughly balanced, both left to right and top to bottom. Okay, let's see what happens if we do this. If we make an alteration here. Oh, I gotta hold it like this because it's hanging by a thread, literally, up on my wall here. Okay, now, is it balanced top to bottom or unbalanced? Should be obvious.
Unbalanced.
Unbalanced.
Yeah, you guys are getting the idea. I won't spend too much time on it, but I want to give at least 3 permutations or variations. Why you would have to, if this is what you see, you're writing about this, or any images like this on your paper, you would say this whatever drawing is unbalanced towards the bottom because there are more objects, or specific, you could say more jellyfish in the bottom half than the top half. That's how you explain and define, you know, where you see or how you see these elements when it comes to balance. Now, what about left to right? I think you're getting the idea already, right? Is it unbalanced or balanced left to right?
Unbalanced.
Yeah, towards the right, because there are 4 jellyfish on the right and only 3 on the left. I don't think I need to do another example. Obviously, I could add 2 more here, and then it's, you know, you get the general idea. The main technique to use, all of these, by the way, all of these elements and how to analyze them are very thoroughly described, and examples are given with some illustrations in Sarah Gill's book, The Critic Sees. Each chapter is on a separate element. That's where this came from. By the way, she developed this system at Columbia when she got her PhD, or maybe shortly after, and used it to teach art history there before she became the art department chair at San Jose JC 20 some years ago when I first was interviewed for this job. So, you know, she's obviously developed a very good system. It's still being used by a lot of art history classes all over the US. Well, certainly in California and New York anyway. Okay, so you get the idea. Are there any questions? So we can move on then from balance to the next of the 9 elements. Any questions about balance? I think it's obvious, yeah. Okay, stable versus dynamic. Again, I always want to start for these 9 elements. I will first read you the definition as it is printed out in your handout. When you're trying to analyze something, a work of art, as to whether or not, whether it is stable or dynamic or both, most works of art are not just one or the other. They have mixtures of dynamic and stable. How do you determine that? Well, look for the presence of two or more diagonal and or curved lines. Either one will make that work of art or that part of that art dynamic. So you look for two or more curved and or diagonal lines. If you see them in any of the objects in a painting or drawing, a building, or even a sculpture, obviously this applies to all the visual arts. Then you can say, well, that work of art is that part of it is dynamic. But what about most works of art have some parts that aren't dynamic? How do you know if something the opposite of dynamic is stable? How do you know if it's stable? That's when you see straight lines or right angles in that section or that whole work of art. There are very few works of art that are totally stable, but there are some, and very few that are completely dynamic. We saw that last week, if you remember, with the painting of the Libyan Sibyl by Michelangelo, where the figures of the baby angel, the cherub, and the Sibyl were all curved lines. They were not, just stiff upright, and then they were turning away. Their bodies were in motion. So of course those two figures were dynamic. That's most of the composition. But the background behind them on the wall, the borders of the marble framing, of the scene they were in front of, that those edges of the marble wall were right angle straight lines. So those were stable. So it's a mixture, but it would be very good to say, if you wanted full credit, this, if you were writing about Libyan Sibyl or any work of art where most of the lines are curved or diagonal, is mostly a dynamic work of art. Because, and then give me an example. That's the rule of thumb for all of these 9 elements. If you want an A, you need to at least cite 2 examples of where you see those elements in that work of art. 2 examples is a good rule. It's not too many. 1 is a little too brief. I mean, you might get a passing grade with that, but I'm sure you all want to get more than a C in this class. Well, anyway, if you do, let's just say, if that's your goal, you would need to give 2 examples at least. And if you have more time, you can give maybe 3 or 4. You don't have to go crazy and list everything you see that's dynamic in a painting or stable, but at least 2 examples. Okay, any questions now about the second element, stable versus dynamic? Any? All right, let's talk about rhythm. Of course, it's very different than musical rhythm. This is visual rhythm. And again, the definition as it is now in your handout, this is the same, number 3 on both the whiteboard and in your handouts, is pretty simple, but I'll give you some examples to make it even more clear. Rhythm is the presence of 2 or more repeated or similar shapes in any visual work of art. Okay, so for instance, a portrait of a person. Well, let's say if no one would ever want to paint my portrait, but anyway, if you saw a portrait of a human being, just their face, even nothing below it, or maybe their neck, there's going to be rhythm by definition. I mean, I can't imagine an exception. Obviously, some people's faces have a different, right, perhaps continents, right? If they're for some reason from some past incident or accident or tragedy, they might be an exception. But even then, they're going to usually have 2 ears, 2 eyes, right? And well, 2 shoulders. Usually, you see at least the shoulders, if not the rest of their upper body. And if it's a bust, then of course usually you're going to see the top part of their arms or their chest. You get the idea. So a portrait, whether it's a single person of just their head and neck, a bust, or their whole body, of course, their whole body, again, rhythm is definitely a part of that image, whether it's a painting, a sculpture, a drawing, or photo. Because if it's a complete human body, it's going to have 2 arms, 2 legs, 2 hands, 2 feet. You get the idea. So you would only need to cite 2 of those things that you see that are repeated shapes. And again, they don't have to be exactly the same in a work of art, those objects. They just have to be very similar. And I leave that to your judgment, as I was saying. You have a lot of discretion in this, but some things are really obvious. If you were to say, I don't see any rhythm in this portrait of King Henry VIII, you'd lose points, because obviously there are. I mean, every portrait of him, the guy that was that horrible monster who had 4 wives killed, married 6 times because he couldn't get a male heir, right? Not one of your great liberated people, right? Well, but he was so powerful. He had a lot of portraits painted of him. They're in almost every art history textbook, I think, has at least one. Anytime you see a portrait of anyone, doesn't matter if they're a king or someone else, lesser known, the human being's portrait is going to have rhythm. And how about groups of people? Always, again, because it's rough, not exact, but a rough similarity between the different human bodies in a group setting, such as a battle scene or a street scene, right? Or a meeting, or a church event, or some kind of inside a cathedral, whatever it is. If it's a group of people, it's going to have rhythm by definition, because again, roughly human bodies are the same overall repeated shapes, right? If you're alive, you have a head, and hopefully most people, of course, would, in any group portrait, would have the 2 arms and 2 legs and so forth. You get the idea. It's pretty easy to determine rhythm with the human body, or images of human bodies, or singular a body. But when it comes to landscapes, sometimes people have more trouble, and it shouldn't be hard to figure out. Landscapes almost always have rhythm, because I don't think I've seen a landscape where there wasn't. If it's mountains, there's going to be roughly the same shape, not exactly, but jagged tops, mountain tops in the background, right? Or if it's a field and a river or a stream, there's going to be trees usually, and bushes, right? Have roughly the same shape. Rocks, right? What about a cityscape? Of course, not exact, but houses, most of them, depending on what city it is, you will see a variety of a slight difference, of a slight variation on roofs. But most of the time, especially with an older painting like from the Renaissance of a city in Italy or wherever, you're going to see roughly the same shape on the buildings, and or the churches with steeples or spires usually have at least some overall similarity. So again, use your judgment, but in any landscape, or if you want to say urban or rural landscape, or any group portrait or individual portrait, you're going to have rhythm. Other than those clear-cut examples, it's just up to you to see if you can find 2 or more of a similar shape, and then you would say where you see them. That's pretty straightforward. Any questions on the third element?
I got one question.
Sure, please.
Say you had just a singular circle. Are you so desperate for rhythm that you'd say, well, the left side is curved the same as the right side? It's got rhythm, even though it's actually only one image?
That's a fun question to answer. I actually addressed that in the lecture that didn't get recorded. So now the student that asked that question, in case they forgot the answer I gave to their own question, will hear it because you just re-asked it. Yeah, no, I'm glad you brought it up. There are very few works of art like that, but yes, there are. Modern art especially, there are some single cubes. There's a church in Geneva, Switzerland, by one of the world's most famous architects, and it looks, they call it the golf ball. The people that live there, in French, of course, that part of Switzerland speaks French, and when you go to it, it's just a big round ball, with the texture of a golf ball. So where's the rhythm there? But the texture of the golf ball. I missed. Well, yeah. What if it was smooth? Okay, I hope this is a part of what you're asking, or this tracks. And you just wanted to write about it. I would suggest you probably want to pick a piece that's a little more varied, but it's your choice. You would just say, good way to write it would be this, whatever it is, building or sculpture, because it could be just a big round ball of marble. That happened in the Renaissance. A lot of architects were experimenting with the globes because they just figured out the world was round, 1490 something, whatever. So yes, it could be that, or a painting of a single object like that. There were a lot of abstract paintings like that, and surrealist paintings, by Magritte, sure, sometimes that happens. It's not that common. And then you just say that. You say, in this painting or sculpture or building, there is no rhythm because it is a single shape. And then you mention the shape, and then that's it. You covered it. But try to pick something with a little more variety, I would say. But that's your choice, yeah. Well, I'll repeat the definition, but okay, because it is on your handout, but I'll repeat it. Rhythm is the presence of 2 or more repeated or similar shapes And of course, I'll add in a visual work of art. We're not talking about musical rhythm. So anytime you see two shapes that look very, very similar to you, it's your call. Now, sometimes it's obvious. If you've got a building and you're writing about that building, quick tip, in architecture, if you're writing a paper on architecture, you only have to describe the exterior features. I don't expect you to get into detail about all the elements inside. You would have to describe the largest rooms because that's how the space is divided. We're going to get to that at the end of tonight's first half when we talk about space at the very end before the break. But for now, let's just say you're writing about a building. Is there rhythm in a building, even if it's a big cube? Well, most buildings have windows. There are a few that don't, but I haven't seen many, and I've traveled all over the world. So you're probably going to see rhythm in the windows, if nothing else. And maybe also there's more than one doorway or something. So there's rhythm, visual rhythm in almost every work of art, except the cubes and the blocks of, stone maybe, or the paintings of things that are just a single object. That's rare, but most of the things you are going to write about are going to have at least two, and they don't have to be exactly the same shape. So use your judgment. That's part of what this course is about. If you think these two, whatever those objects are, let's say two boulders in a landscape that are right at the front of a path leading off into the hills, and to you those boulders don't look close enough to each other that you think they have rhythm. Right? One's very large, one's very small. You could say there's no rhythm in the bottom of this painting. And I would accept that, even though to me, two boulders are two boulders, they are vaguely similar. But of course, you could see it differently. So I'm trying to give you some, I hope, helpful, kind of a heads up for what you can do with your papers. But when it's like, I just said, a group portrait of a group of people, no matter where they are, a group scene, a portrait of one or more individuals, of any kind, portrait of any people, or any kind of landscape or cityscape, you're gonna have rhythm because the shapes are similar or nearly the same, and there's going to be at least two of each of many of those shapes. Okay, can we move on now to the next one? I need to stand up for this one too. Hang on. Line. We'll do that next, which in the order I have it here is, yes, the same as is on the board. This is a little more complex because line can be used in several ways. So first, we'll just do the simplest, most obvious use of line, and that's when it's an outline around an object in a painting or a drawing. So if that's the case, if there's outline, you need to define where you see, if you see bold or thick. I could have said thick, but bold's the more correct term for art history. So bold, or if you prefer to write thick in parentheses, outlines are pretty obvious because especially if they're in a painting or drawing where there's both bold and thin, the thin lines are going to just be thinner and you can see the difference. Again, use your judgment, but bold outlines are present in most Renaissance paintings which show bodies, human or divine, holy figures, like Michelangelo's. We covered this last week, remember, with the Libyan Sibyl. There was bold outline around both the baby angel, the cherub, and the Sibyl. And that's a technique that Michelangelo pioneered and used in almost all his paintings. When any human or divine, figure of a person or living thing is in his paintings, he used the bold outlines around their body almost always, because he wanted you to focus on them and see them as standing out or distinct from the background. So look first for the line being used as outline, and if it is, check whether there's some bold and or thin lines, and if so, give me examples, at least two of each one. So you see, this technique of line is going to take you more than one sentence or even two maybe to write about, depending on whether, now it might be though, some painters don't use outline at all. And of course, abstract art doesn't use outlines. However, there's a couple other ways to use lines. So let's go over those and then I'll take any questions. Another way line can be used is shading, but this, I'm going to keep it simple and say, don't even think about it with paintings. It's too complicated to tell. Did the artist take their brush and go crosshatch like that? Unless it's really obvious, usually you only see this kind of shading, lines used to create shading. It's called crosshatching. By the way, Sarah Gill describes it in really great detail. Is only obvious in a drawing. So if you have a drawing, like an engraving, and you can see some shading, and you can see the lines were used, right? Of course, how else would they create it if they're not using paint? It would be with ink, of course, or whatever medium they're using. And they would have lines overlapping, cross hatching. It's called, that would be the use of line as shading. And if you see it in only one place, that's all you have to say. But normally there's going to be more than one object in an engraving if the artist uses that technique. Where you can see it, so give at least two examples of where, if you do see line being used as shading. Now, the other two categories are carved line. That's what sculptures do. So let's take a moment to give an example. Everyone can visualize, I know you can in your minds, and that's the statue of David by Michelangelo, the big 16.5 foot tall, the largest human figure ever carved out of a single piece of stone, ever, that we know of in human history. I said single piece of stone, right? There are much bigger statues, but they weren't made out of one piece of stone. So that's a major fact about it. But a more interesting fact for our use in this number 4, this technique of line, is how did Michelangelo create the impression of the face with the eyes and the ears and the mouth and the hair and then the muscles and the fingers, nails and toenails? It's all so realistic. He used carved, like all sculptors would if it's a realistic sculpture of a human body or any kind of animal or human figure. It's going to have carved line. And that's pretty simple to see. You can see it at a glance. So you'd say this artist used carved line on the face to create what? Give me two examples: the eyes and the mouth or whatever. Then you've covered that aspect or that element of line for sculpture. And then I'll do the last one, the way that line can be used, and then I'll take questions before we move on to number 5. The final use of line is in architecture. And usually in a building, you don't see lines unless they sometimes are painted on the outside of the building. Giant T's on a building by a certain person who was recently president. You could call that line, but really it isn't, because it's a giant gold object tacked onto a building, right? I wouldn't call that line. So where do you see lines in most architecture? It's visual. Keep that in mind. Now, I would write that in the margin of your notes, the actual, because I don't think I put that on this handout, because I want to keep the one page. Visual line is what you see in architecture. So you'd actually have to insert that or write it on another piece of paper, which means what? Well, in the photo of that building that you're going to work from a photo, of course, an image of a building. If you choose to write about architecture, you will see the edges of the building where the shadows, right, create a visual line, or the edges are framing around a door or a window. So buildings do have a kind of line, and it's visual line formed by the corners of the building, the edges of the various sections of it. When the light creates, shadow on one side and it's sunny on the other, looks like a line, but it's not carved or drawn, so it's called visual line. Same thing around doors and windows. Okay, I know this one is more complex than the previous 3. So are there any questions on that? Because I'm going to sit down for the next 2, and then a couple more things I'll illustrate. But as we go, this is a good chance to ask questions if things aren't clear, or if you think of another example like we just had about the single round objects. And those are important questions that we're all here to make sure everyone's clear. Anybody have any questions about line? All right, number 5 is a pretty easy one. And I can tell you right now, I don't know why, but it consistently through all the years I've been teaching with this method of art history and analyzing, the compositions, it's the most commonly overlooked or forgotten of the 9 elements when students write their papers. And, if you forget one, you already lost several points before I even start grading the paper. So why do that, to yourself? So I have this list, like I said. So here it's number 6, okay, on your handout, obviously. But it should be pretty easy, but I will read the definition slowly and then see if there are any questions. Mass, or multiple objects that have mass, plural, or masses, or the volume in a work of art. How do you recognize those? You ask yourself, what are the largest objects or parts in a work of art? And then you decide what look like the largest parts or objects in that painting, drawing, sculpture, or on a building. And I'll give you an example. I actually drew it at the upper corner there of King Kong falling off the Empire State Building. I'll get to that in a minute, but let's just finish that definition. Well, how do you write that? You say, okay, the three largest masses or sections of a work of art, the three largest objects, the size of the object is its mass in a painting, a drawing, a photo, a sculpture. Or if it's a single object like a skyscraper, like the Empire State Building, which I'm going to describe in a minute, it's going to have sections. Some are larger than others. Did we get someone else joining us here? Yeah, here we go. Okay, we were just doing, we're on the elements of composition, but you can watch the part of this you missed on YouTube by 8 p.m. this Friday, but we're moving on now. We're just doing number 6, or actually it's, yeah, on your handout, masses. Okay, so in other words, all I ask you to do to get full credit on this element is to list, or identify is a better word, identify in a full sentence, right? Not bullet points. But by the way, people that give me outline formats with bullet points, that's points off. That's not an essay. It's pretty easy to know the difference, but in case, it isn't clear, you do need to write in full, complete sentences in paragraph format for all of these sections. And then, of course, on the meaning. And I'll talk to you all guys next week when you get the handout from me and a sample paper of how your paper should be written. We'll go over that in detail next week. Okay, to finish up on masses, you just need to identify the 3 largest masses in a work of art. So let's say this was the one you were writing about for some reason, the Empire State Building. Of course, you wouldn't have an image unless you took a still from one of the, how many are there, 5 movies of King Kong now? Starting with the best and first. I tell you, in my honest opinion, no one ever outdid the 1933 black and white King Kong. Considering what special effects were limited to, it's a remarkably advanced film for its age. But anyway, so some of you have seen a version, maybe the Jack Black version or something, of that movie. You might at least have heard what happens is the giant gorilla climbs up to the top of the Empire State Building, clings to the spire, and is killed by airplanes who are shooting at him and falls down. Okay, so that's what that is. So that's not important to the analysis. I just want to give you a reference to get your attention. Okay, so let's say you're writing about a skyscraper, and we'll just take the Empire State Building. It's pretty straightforward as to what are the largest masses. When you look at that photo of that building, that structure, skyscraper, or whatever kind of building, you'll see one, most of the time, there are exceptions, of course, but most of the time, especially the skyscraper, the largest mass is the shaft, right? That's the only word for it. The part that is the tallest. It's 80 stories tall in the Empire State Building. The building's 102 stories, right? So 80 of those stories are in the middle section, which is therefore the largest mass. So that's what you'd say. In this building, the Empire State Building, the largest mass is the central section or shaft, which is 80 stories high. Okay, then the second largest mass is the base, which I believe is around 15 or 20 stories in the Empire State Building, before it narrows up to the shaft. And that would be the second largest mass. And then the smallest mass would be the spire, the roof top and spire, because it's all one big piece of cast metal. I don't know if any of you have been to New York, but when you see the Empire State Building, it's pretty impressive. They did that in 1930, that building, and it was the tallest building in the world for decades. In any case, a building usually can be divided or is divided, and a photo of it can be described in your papers with, what sections are the largest. And we'll talk about that when we have any slide of architecture during the lectures as to what are the largest masses as we go along. And yes, there will be at least one question, maybe 2, about architecture on both the midterm and the final. And so then you might want to remember this technique of breaking down that building into sections and just identifying the largest 3. I think it's pretty straightforward. Any questions about mass? Okay. All right. Moving on to textures. Well, textures gets a little complex, but it's susceptible to pretty straightforward categorizing. So what do we need to know, or do you need to know, to write about texture in a work of art? Well, there's 2 kinds of textures. There's simulated, that's with an SI, no T, right? Simulated textures or real textures. So let's talk about simulated textures. And I wrote this on the board, but it's here on your handout. When an artist uses lines, colors, and shading, or any combination of line, color, and shading, To create the illusion of real textures, that's called simulated textures. And a good example in every realistic work of art, not just Renaissance paintings, because we're going all the way back to prehistoric times. Tonight, after the break, you'll see whether or not you tell me if there's any simulated texture in a cave painting. I don't want to give it away, but I think when you see the first slide after the break, you'll see pretty clear whether there is. Did that caveman or person, it could have been a woman, but a shaman, whoever it was that did the artist that did that painting on the wall of a cave 18,000 years ago, use any kind of color or line to create the illusion of textures on the animals that they were painting? Well, you'll see for yourself. That's what you should look for, to ask yourself. And with a portrait, again, with human beings, there's no question there's simulated texture if it's a realistic portrait. The abstract paintings of the last 70 years or so often make human beings look like monsters, right, or are totally unrealistic. So they might not have simulated texture, But if a painting is a realistic painting, whether it's of a person or a group of people, of a landscape, cityscape, whatever, or a room, if it's a realistic painting or drawing or sharp focused photograph, it's going to have simulated texture, and that's going to be either one of two ways that simulated textures can be seen. Either they're sharp, and you can also use the word realistic in a Renaissance or any other realistic style painting, because plenty of people are still doing realistic style paintings today. You're going to have sharp or realistic simulated textures. And then you need to give me those two examples I've been repeating to get full credit. Where do you see the sharp, realistic simulated textures? It's pretty easy on a portrait. Usually it's the hair and the clothing and the skin, maybe all three. But all you have to do is give me at least two examples. Or if it's like a soldier, maybe their armor and their, skin or their beard are sharp and realistic simulated textures. That's how you'd write that. And then what is the other kind of simulated texture? The other main subcategory is soft or diffused. And that's what you'd see in an impressionist painting, where the artist isn't trying to create a realistic, sharp image of something, but they're implying that there's texture, different textures on the trees, right? And maybe the people that are in a park, let's say. They always like painting parks, right? Mostly in Paris and other parts of France, right? The Impressionists, which we are not covering in this class, but you may well want to write a paper about. Their textures were implied, or diffused is a better word, diffused. They were not sharp and realistic, but there is some Impressionist painters got so far away from realism that you can't really say there's much simulated texture at all. You be the judge. But certainly there wouldn't be any truly Impressionist painting. There would not be any realistic simulated textures, unless you're looking at the handful of Impressionists that like to dabble, where half the painting was realistic and the other half, if you saw Ferris Bueller's Day Off, anybody, right? The famous painting in the Chicago Art Institute. I grew up looking at that painting of the couple with the umbrellas walking in the rain through the streets of Paris, right? That couple's realistic, and everything behind them, or most of the objects and people behind them, are not sharp and realistic. So there's simulated texture of both types. There's sharp and realistic in the foreground, and soft and diffused in the background, and then just say where. Okay, so this takes a little more time to write about, to analyze. What is the other half or other type, major category of textures? Real textures. And we covered that, I think, last week. Yeah, we did, with the Frank Lloyd Wright, right? The Guggenheim Museum. When you see writing about a building, it's almost always real textures. It's not simulated, because the building is made out of certain kind of material. And with this an ancient Greek or Roman or Egyptian temple, it's going to be the real rough texture of stone. Well, some of those were made out of marble, and the marble might look smooth to you. I give you that option. If it looks smooth, like smooth stone, it's fine to say it that way, because you can't go to that building, and you just have to use what you think it looks like in a photo of the building that you're writing about. So textures in a building are almost always real, and you need to say, what are those materials? Just two or three examples enough. With a skyscraper, it's going to be metal and glass and maybe concrete, probably all three, right? And that would almost always be smooth, all three. Concrete usually is smooth, at least on the outside of a building, especially if it's not really, really old. And then smooth glass and steel. Of course, a lot of skyscrapers now are just glass and steel. So there are only two textures, the metal, usually it's steel, and the glass. Both are real smooth textures. You got that covered there for that particular example. Okay, so there we go. That textures is a little more, varieties of options. So any questions on that before we move on to the last few elements? Anybody? Nope. Okay. Now, let's take a look and see if what we're at now is going to be modeling. Yeah, I got to stand up and show you for this because I spent some time doing this Mickey Mouse illustration here. Modeling, of course, we're talking about the technique, not the profession. Modeling can be either sharp or soft, but what is it? Okay, I have it listed as number 9, as you can see on your handouts here. So if you look down at the bottom, I'll just go over the definition and then point out the example I drew up here for you to look at. Modeling is the use of contrasting areas of light and dark, or shading, you can say just shading, which is contrasting areas of light and dark to create the illusion of a three-dimensional object. So let's take this giant ball of, since one of you brought this up, maybe you're writing about a single ball of stone or metal or wood, whatever, and a piece of sculpture, which there have been, I've seen a few. Michelangelo did some of those, but he did them on top of the staircases of his buildings. Michelangelo was an architect as much as a sculptor and a painter. He actually preferred architecture. In his mind, it was the more superior of the 3 arts that he was a master at. So he did these giant round balls of marble, different colored marble and stuff, and then he put them on top of the staircase newel posts, around the palaces and other public buildings he designed. So let's say we're looking at one of those, and there's a window, right, where the sun's coming through, and I put an arrow to show, let's say the direction of the light is from the lower right side. Then if you're seeing a photo or a drawing or a painting of that single round object, you would see the part where the light's hitting is lighter, and where the light does not shine on the upper half would be in shadow. And I know my drawing is not, the greatest, but you get, I think, enough of the concept from this, that is supposed to create the illusion of a 3-dimensional object in a painting or drawing. Right? It doesn't apply, modeling does not apply to sculpture. And it really doesn't apply to architecture, but I've had students get extra thorough, and I think that's commendable, but you don't have to, saying there is no modeling as a technique in this building, but I see shadows around the doors and windows, so that creates natural modeling from the sunlight. Great. That's going a little extra than you need to get a good grade, but that shows you, you had your initiative, but you don't have to write about modeling in a building unless there's some unusual quality why the architect designed the courtyard, say a light court, inside where the sunlight at certain times of the day, then you might need to mention that there's natural modeling from the sun. But you're looking at the exterior mostly anyway, a photo, as I just said. If you're writing about a building, you only have to describe the features on the outside, except for space. When we get to space, I'll explain why you do have to discuss the interior then. That's the last element. So with a building, you don't usually need to mention modeling, and the same with sculpture. It's just shadows created by the sun, which change all the time. So it's not a technique. But with all the other 3, including photos have areas of light and dark, even if they're black and white. There'll be shadows in a photo, most photos anyway. And therefore there is a kind of modeling. And is it sharp or soft? That's what you have to say. And if so, where do you see the modeling in that photo, drawing, or painting? And if some of it is sharp and soft, and some of it is some of it is sharp and some of it is soft, you would say where. Give one example at least of each of the areas that you see a sharp, realistic modeling or shadowing, and maybe another section of that same painting or drawing, whatever, where it isn't so sharp and soft, where it's diffused. I said sharp again. It either is going to be sharp or soft. Diffused is another word for soft, and I believe I wrote it, right there under there. So you have pretty straightforward. That this element is pretty evident. Once you see it, if there's some kind of shadowing used by, or modeling used by. And I had a student in my last afternoon class ask, can we just say shadowing? That's a little too nebulous because when my readers grade the papers, I might understand what you're saying, but some of them might not. They don't want to take a chance. So stick to the terminology as it is on this handout. When you're describing each of those elements, you should use the term modeling. And then you can say, in your examples, I see strong shadows on this or that object, which creates sharp or realistic modeling. And over on the other side, it's soft and diffused on the whatever object that has soft modeling. Again, 2 examples. That's the rule of thumb for all of these, for each of these 9 elements to get full credit. Okay, let's see. Do I have any? Oh, you're talking about, yeah. Yeah, actually, I like all 3 versions, but the one that was kind of the least interesting was the 1976 Jessica Lange version. I mean, she was fine in it, but I don't know, it was something about the, oh, I know why, because they didn't use the Empire State Building. They used the Twin Towers, the ones that were destroyed on 9/11. It's hard to believe that was 20 years ago. Some of you won't remember. Those of us who were around. 20 years almost since that happened. Anyway, so I hope we're clear now on this element, which of course is now 2 more. These are going to be the complex ones. Modeling. Any questions about the use of modeling? Oh, I like Jeff Bridges. I wasn't picking on him. You know what? It's funny. I almost said something about that. I didn't think he was. And then I said, no, he was just as good as Jeff Black. And I don't remember the names of the actors in the 1930 movies, except Fay Ray, who played the love interest of King Kong. She did a great job. She even, I think, got nominated for Academy Award for that. I think, maybe not, but anyway, successful movie ever since it came out. Still shown sometimes in live movie theaters where they still show movies. Anyway, my point is just that 2 examples. However you see these, you will have flexibility, and I will be, I don't want to say lenient. That sounds like I'm going to lower my standards from what I've told you they would be. No, but 2 examples is a reasonable minimum for each of these elements. And if you only give 1, you get at least a couple points off, or 1 or 2 points off. And if you did that in all 9 elements, would do the math, you already dropped at least a whole letter grade before the whole rest of the paper is even graded. Okay, so keep that in mind. And next week, we'll cover these in detail. Okay, let's move on to the 2 most complex elements. And I think we're going to end up with a slightly earlier break, which is nothing wrong with, because that means if we finish the break, of course, that would mean we would finish the break earlier. We may finish with the last slide a little earlier too, and in the class earlier. I'm sure no one objects to that. All right, color. These are more complex, these last 2 techniques. Color can be one of 3 types. Warm colors or earth tones, I've listed them here for you, the main ones. Red, yellow, orange, gold, brown, and pink. Okay, those are used by artists to create the impression that those objects, which have the warm colors on them in a painting or a photo, right, or drawing, are advancing toward the viewer. In other words, they look more obvious or clearly discernible, I guess, is visible. You notice them, and that's a simple way of saying it. Human beings, unless you don't have full normal color vision, of course, and if you do, your brain subconsciously even will register the warm colors first. It's just an involuntary human reaction to the difference between cool and warm colors. So what's the opposite of warm colors? Of course, I've listed them here, are cool tones. And there are 4 major categories of those: blue, green, gray, and white. And they're used when an artist wants that part of that work of art to recede or to appear to be further away from the viewer and or be less important. So to emphasize an object in a painting, a drawing, or or even in a building, you could do that. Of course, the parts of some buildings have multiple color schemes. Most buildings don't have more than 2 or 3 colors on the outside, but some do. Right? Or certainly it's true with a painting or drawing or a color photo. Your eyes will pick out the objects with the warm colors first. And that's why an artist uses them, to try and emphasize those objects and have you notice them first. And then usually the background or the surrounding area is more likely to be the cool colors. All right, and then the third category is neutral. That's when black and white, and I should have added or shades of gray. So the use of black and white together, or when you have black and white with just only other tone is gray, in other words, no warm colors at all, that would make that work of art neutral because it doesn't have the main elements of green, right? Or I mean, sorry, hues, I meant of green, right? Or blue. And there's no contrast between black and white together with no warm colors and gray is not a warm color, right? That's considered neutral. And there's plenty of examples of that in Renaissance engravings and in some modern paintings. A lot of black and white photography, of course, then that by definition, the whole photo in a black and white photo, it's all neither warm nor cool because there's no contrast in a photo where the artist chose, the photographer deliberately to not use color and just have a black and white print, which of course is going to have shades of gray. And that's all called neutral, either because there's no contrast to separate the colors warm and cool from each other. But what about purple? That's a bit of a, if I can make a mistake and say gray area, that oops, that would be. Purple is usually more reddish purple or more bluish because obviously purple is a blend of red and blue. So when you have purple in a painting or drawing or anything you're writing about in this class, you decide, you have total discretion. If you see it as a more warm-sided purple, then that means you see a more reddish tone in that purple. And I don't have any examples now, but I'm going to show you proof of what I said in just a minute. I'm going to hold up a print from the cover of an old magazine that's it's a reproduction, of course, from the turn of the, or not the early 1900s, 100 years ago. And you'll see what I mean about how warm colors appear to advance toward. But before we get to that, just to finish up on that thing about purple, is one of those that can be either. If it's got more bluish tones in that purple that you're writing about, that part of that painting or drawing, whatever, then you'd say it's a more of a cool version of purple. Okay, so I think you just can use your judgment, your discretion on that. Purple is a good example. And there's one other. Some shades of green, as I'm sure some of you have already thought this, but no one's asked it, so I'll just say, can be more yellowish green, can't they? They could be, that means it's a warmer green than maybe a flat green or a bluish green. You know, like, you know, some of the colors of the water, right, in some paintings are bluish green, as water often really appears to be, not strictly blue, is it rarely just totally, you know, flat green, right? So you use your discretion when you see either different tones or shades of green as to how much of the warmish yellow tone it has and which way that makes it to you more warm than cool. That you have total discretion on. Same thing with purple. I think that's pretty clear. Finally, all skin tones, all human skin tones are considered warm by definition without any need to discuss it. So any images of human beings are going to have on the skin warm tones. Okay, let's do this. This will be quick, but I think you'll find it very helpful. I just started doing this like 2 semesters ago when I realized my wife had all these prints on the wall that give you some idea. Let's see, I always have to remember. This is the cover of a magazine from 1919. And guess what was happening then? The horribly devastating pandemic. We were about to hit the same number of deaths, you know that from, but that's when we only had 100 million people. So what is we, like a third of a billion now? So per capita, it was more than 3 times as deadly as COVID. The Spanish flu, they called it, which is another misnomer because it didn't start in Spain, but that's what they called it. You've all heard of it, right? The last pandemic, it was about 100 years ago. This is 1919. It was right in the middle of that pandemic where people still bought houses. So this is a magazine that was published about, you know, how to decorate a design or buy and improve or whatever. Now, let me see. I had that before. How come that? Why is that reflecting when it wasn't just a minute ago? Okay, I may need to stand up here. Let's see how this looks, if that's any better. I want you to see that now that's not the color. There we go. Okay, that works, even if it's an odd angle. What colors do you notice first, or what objects in this painting? Anybody?
The roof.
The house. Exactly. The house, because it's warm colors. The red on the roof, the yellow on the wall, and the brown trim around the windows. That's a deliberate choice the artist made. Of course, it's a drawing, right? Or it might be a painting, but it's probably, actually, it is. It's actually a painting. So this painting, the artist chose those warm colors so you would notice the house, because the magazine is all about, well, gardens and homes, but this issue was about decorating your home. If you just bought one or you looked to want to buy one, and choices you could make. Yeah, this magazine might still be around. Anyway, there are plenty of magazines like it. So the artist deliberately chose warm colors for the house, the object he wants the viewer to notice first. And that, of course, those are obvious warm colors, the red, the yellow, and the brown, or, sort of light brown on the window trim. And then you notice afterwards the cool colors, the trees, the dark green, the pale blue sky, and the white picket fence and the grass.
Are those trees or smoke?
They're supposed to be trees. They're very stylized. 1919 was an interesting, well, not that year, but the early 1900s is an era when there was a lot of experimenting with, this isn't a strictly realistic image. The house is even a little stylized. I mean, there are houses that they call them storybooks. Some of you know what I'm talking about. In Beverly Hills and parts of the East Bay and San Francisco, you see a few houses like this from the 1910s and 20s. Hansel and Gretel's storybook, whatever. But it's distorted even at that. And then the trees are completely distorted, almost kind of like Van Gogh painting, actually. And Van Gogh's painting was well known by this time. He'd been dead for 40 years. So what you see here, 30, what you see here is the point I'm making, is a contrasting use of warm and cool colors in a mass-produced, this magazine had hundreds of thousands of readers, every month, I think it was. And the warm colors are what the artist wants you to see first, wants you to notice, because the house is what's important in this picture. Okay, you get the idea. Any questions on color? We're doing well on the time here, but we are going to need at least 14 or 15 minutes, I would say, to go over the most complex technique, space, the final technique. Okay. Any questions before we get on to the last technique of space? There are 6 different ways to depict space that you need to know about in this class. Okay. This is a Western art class, because there are different techniques in Asia, and I even collected when I was in China, legally bought from government authorized shops, a couple of works of Chinese art, but we aren't covering that in this class. So we're just sticking to the 6 main techniques that Western artists use to depict space. But before we leave color, are there any questions about color? I think it's pretty clear. And of course, I just said you can use your discretion. So I'm not going to, if you see something as more warm than cool, like a purple or a yellowish green, than I would, I'm not going to take points off for that if you see it that way, as long as you state it and why. Okay, so now we do need to go back to our whiteboard here, because these elements get progressively more complex. Space in a 2-dimensional work of art, and we'll finish up with the 3-dimensional version, which is architecture, and how that differentiates, I should say, how it's different from the way you write about space in a 2-dimensional work of art. So all of these techniques, these 6 that you do need to address if you're writing about a painting or a drawing or a photograph or a flat piece of sculpture, right? That would be bas relief, right? We're going to cover all these terms later, but a panel, a sculptural panel of these related, those are all 2-dimensional works of art. All these terms are techniques that could be used in various visual arts that are 2-dimensional. So let's start with the simplest one, overlapping. I think it's pretty straightforward and almost self-explanatory, but again, because I didn't write all these definitions down until I got to these last 2, because these are the most complicated ones. Overlapping is the oldest technique of depicting space known to the human race. You'll see it in the first slide after the break, the first cave painting. And that's when you have 2 or more objects, and the object that is supposed to be closest to us overlaps the one that's further away. Pretty straightforward, right? I mean, when you see it, right? Overlapping. Again, if you have questions as we go, before we move on to each of these 6 techniques, stop and ask. Okay, register line is a little bit more complicated, but it's also one of the oldest techniques for depicting space in the history of human art. And that's when the artist draws 2 or more lines directly onto the composition, whether it's a drawing, a painting, or a flat, piece of sculpture, they actually draw or carve in a sculpture, of course, two or more lines, and then the objects that are placed on the lower lines are supposed to be closer or meant to be seen as closer to the viewer than those objects that are placed on the upper lines. The Egyptians used this technique a lot. You're going to see it when we get to Egyptian art. I guess 2 weeks from tonight. Yeah, because it's one of the most simple and easy to both use and obvious when you see it, because the line is visible right there on the surface of that work of art. You don't see it much after from the Middle Ages on, you rarely see it, but after even Roman art didn't use it much. So after early ancient art and prehistoric, you don't see too much of the register line, but you could, and it depends on what you're writing about. So you can look for that. And by the way, if any of these techniques are not present for space, I'm talking about now on the last category, in the work of art, you have to say that in your paper. It makes it pretty easy because you don't need to show examples. If there was no overlapping, well, usually works of art with two or more objects do have overlapping. But let's say there's no register line. Don't just ignore that element. Say it that way. Say, there is no register line in this work of art, period. Then you've covered it. So you get full credit on that part of your analysis of space. Okay, what about diminishing size? That's also a pretty straightforward technique. Pardon my Mickey Mouse artwork here again with these stick figures, but I don't want to get too complicated. So let's say that what you're looking at with diminishing size is when those objects that are closest to the viewer in a work of art with this technique are shown as larger, and those objects further away from the viewer are shown as smaller, which is what I attempted to do with these three, I guess you could say, running stick men. Or people. That's again pretty self-explanatory. I think it's actually how human beings really perceive objects as they are further and further away from us. They look to be smaller, and of course we know they're not than they really are, but they look smaller as they are further, as we perceive them further into the distance. So it's a fairly accurate way of depicting objects in space, and it's pretty old. It goes back to ancient times at least. I don't think cave people didn't, painters, didn't use these. Okay, now we're getting to a slightly more complex technique, foreshortening. We are going to look at Stonehenge. I've been there, and I'll tell you, I almost got arrested. First time I went there. Yeah, that's the story to tell you what not to do if you ever go to Stonehenge. I learned a lesson. Luckily for me, it wasn't as drastic as it could have been. But that's at the end of tonight's lecture. So foreshortening is very visible on the stones of Stonehenge. When you've seen photos of it, if you haven't, you will tonight after the break. Most of you know, it's giant 22-foot tall pieces of stone, the tallest ones. Most of them have fallen over. Some of them have been stolen, but the ones that are still there, many of them, if not half or more, have fallen onto the ground. So let's take a work of art where you imagine the artist is painting or drawing one of those fallen giant blocks of stone at Stonehenge. Then foreshortening is a technique where that part of an object closest to the viewer, I'm outlining it here, is shown as wider than that part of an object further away from the viewer. I'll repeat that. Foreshortening is a technique for depicting space in which that part of an object closest to the viewer is shown as wider, and that part farthest away is shown as narrower. I think once you see these things, it becomes obvious. Obviously, it applies to an object that's receding backwards into space that's, got some length to it. It wouldn't apply to a round ball, right? It's an example we had earlier tonight, or an object that's just right in front of us, right? And it's very short. So longer objects that, are depicted, at some length will have this technique if it's a realistic work of art. Okay, any questions so far before we get to the two more complex techniques? And then I can take general questions at the end, and we still should be able to take an early break. Any questions on the first four techniques? Anybody? Okay.
For number 3, what was the name of that? It was something size?
Diminishing, yeah. I hope my writing is clear. I know sometimes it isn't always. It's one word, diminishing. I did spell these correctly. I double checked. And size. And I believe I listed them on your handout, but I didn't write the definitions. That's why it's when objects, right? You see how these stick figures are, that are closest to the viewer are shown as larger, and those further away are shown as smaller. So it's pretty straightforward. It's listed but not defined. So you see how I put space is number 7 here.
Oh yeah, got it.
Yeah, good. Thanks. Okay. Atmospheric perspective, that takes a little more explanation. All right. So I will say the definition slowly and repeat it. That's a technique for depicting space, or you can say depth. Either word is appropriate, but I'm sticking with space because that encompasses all these techniques, or depth. So again, I'll restate that. Atmospheric perspective is a technique for depicting space or depth in a two-dimensional color. It only applies to color work of art. Okay. In which those objects farthest from the viewer are shown bluer and hazier than those objects closest to the viewer. I'll say it again. It's a technique for depicting space in a two-dimensional color work of art in which those objects closest to the viewer are shown as bluer and hazier. There's no other way to write it. Than those objects closest to the viewer. If it's not really a clear image in your head yet, I think everyone knows when you drive across a mountain pass, let's take Cotati. It's not really a mountain, right? But Cotati Grade, right? I come up that way all the time from Berkeley, and you've all driven over it, I would imagine, right? At some point to get between Petaluma and Santa Rosa. Look out to the west. It has to be, of course, when the sun's out. It doesn't apply at night, you know. Well, it could. Some nights the moon's bright enough to create, but it's rare. So it's just usually during the daytime. And when you look out across Cotati Grade, you know, when you're near the top of it on 101, just be careful about the cars in either lane on either side of you. Just glance over to the west and you'll see this effect. It's unavoidable. It's how the atmosphere affects our vision of things in the distance because of the various objects, pollutants, you know, well, now smoke, and of course, just gases that are in, you know, or even specks of dirt, whatever, it doesn't matter what it is, there are objects in the air. The air is not a vacuum, of course. So when we see things further away, those objects become enough of a filter, if you want to put it that way, between our vision and the distant object that they create a blue hazy effect. It just, again, it's just an unavoidable effect of nature. So I think some of you have already noticed this. And if you've taken painting, you know, or, you know, certain kinds of composition art studio classes, you already know this. Okay, any questions on that technique? And then we're going to get to the most complex, the last one. Okay, scientific perspective is a technique. Now, this one has a full definition that I think I did write down. I did write it down, but I'm going to give it to you anyway and make sure you can see how it relates to this rather minimal Mickey Mouse diagram I drew for you. Scientific perspective is a technique for depicting space in a two-dimensional work of art. Sorry, this is a long one. Invented during the Italian Renaissance. It didn't exist before that. Again, a technique for depicting space or depth in a two-dimensional work of art that was invented during the Italian Renaissance, comma, in which the artist draws a series of diagonal lines onto the composition, which all meet at a common vanishing point on the horizon line. I should have probably written horizon line, but that should be obvious. That's what I'm put there, is that line is the horizon. I'll say it one more time. Scientific perspective is a technique for depicting space in a two-dimensional work of art in which the artist draws a series of diagonal lines onto the composition, which all meet at a common vanishing point on the horizon. So let's see, do you see those lines in most of those works of art? Of course not. The artist would use chalk or something, you know, pastel or something, you know, pencil even, on the canvas or on the wall if they're doing a fresco or whatever surface they're going to paint on. They draw the lines in the vanishing point first and then paint over that. But they make sure that all the objects that are in that, you know, below the horizon line are going to fade, you know, along that progressing set of lines and therefore evenly appear to be smaller in size. So in a way you could say, actually no one mentioned this in the last class they taught, I just thought of it now. It's kind of like a much more sophisticated way of using diminishing size, because the objects should get smaller the further back, the closer towards the horizon they get in an even way. Van Gogh, for instance, he studied that technique. He had to learn how to paint in his early day. Well, he didn't have to. He wasn't a student in an art class. He wasn't going for a degree, but he wanted to. And he just didn't like having to do the measurements. So genius that he was, he figured out how to do a freehand version of it since he understood the concept. But sometimes he did, even late in his life, occasionally, there have been ways of verifying that he actually did occasionally take out an instrument and draw those lines. If you've taken perspective, a lot of people have at the JC or anywhere else, perspective art class, studio class, you've already done this technique. So most of the time you don't see those vanishing lines, those diagonal lines, I meant diagonal lines, or the vanishing point. They're painted over, right? Or drawn over if it's a drawing. Sometimes you do, in some Renaissance paintings, you might see, floor tiles in a palace, right? Stone tiles on the floor, or in a room, of a house, or a residence, or even a church, where the wood's floor, I meant the floor is made out of wood, and the wood panels form those lines. But that's the exception. Usually those lines are not visible because they've been painted over. So again, use your discretion. Sometimes you can look it up and find out, yes, this painting definitely has already been analyzed. Someone did an X-ray of it, or infrared, whatever analysis, and they saw the lines under the painting. That's rare. Usually you just look and you can see, does everything seem to be fading evenly towards the horizon in this city or townscape, or this landscape, or this group scene? Now, you won't have scientific perspective usually in a close-up view of anything. Like a single human portrait, you're not going to have scientific perspective, or even a small group portrait of people in a single room. Sometimes you would in that kind of painting. I leave it again to what you see and what your discretion is. And if you think there is atmospheric and/or scientific, obviously atmospheric perspective applies to outdoor, right, scenes.
I'd be willing to bet you could find both in a Dali painting.
Oh, yes, you're right. Oh, absolutely. Good point to bring up too, because at the end of the last class, which wasn't being recorded, so now this will be, good timing for you to ask that question. In lots of paintings, surrealism, sometimes Dali, I think he pronounced his name. Anyway, he almost always did that because he used, the name of his style says surrealism. So every kind of painting, whatever it's the early Renaissance, where these techniques were first developed and perfected, these last two techniques, actually the Romans had atmospheric perspective. We'll see that. They mastered that, but they didn't have scientific perspective. There are some people who think they did, but there's been no proof of that. They just thought about the concept and they just never developed it actually as a measuring device technique, which is what scientific perspective implies. You measured the lines, right, to get them to match. So yes, Dali did that. You're right. He did both. The horizons of his paintings usually have the atmospheric blue hazy look. And then, of course, he would have used in at least his outdoor scenes and landscapes and things, many of them, scientific perspective. Maybe not all his paintings, but many. And you'll see that in a lot of the works of art that you may choose to write about, assuming some of you are going to write papers about works done after the Middle Ages, because we end with the beginning of the Renaissance. But you remember, can pick any topic from any period, any style, any artist to write about for your two papers. Yes, so it's a good point. Very many of the last, say, 6 centuries of Western art, of realistic style paintings, including Dali, did both. Absolutely. Okay, let's see. I don't see any other questions here yet, except for one last thing before we take our break. No, don't sign off yet. This is really important. You're going to have to write about architecture on, I already said this, I think, right? At least one slide of to analyze on the midterm, and at least one of architecture on the final. And you may choose to write about them on your papers. Okay, so how is space handled in a building? There's no technique. And I've had students turn papers in even after I've said this in class or had it recorded on YouTube and forget. And they'll write, there's no techniques for space in this work of art because it's a building. You just dropped a grade. It's like the whole most important fact about buildings are, what is the interior space divided up to? You remember, if you were here for last week's lecture, those of you who saw the whole thing, up at the end when we finished up with the Frank Lloyd Wright building, right? That's what I said then, and I'm going to say it again and repeat it at least whenever the first few architecture slides in the slide lecture portion of the class get going. With architecture, there is no techniques, none for space. It's all real space. So how do you write about space with a building? You just describe, let's keep it simple, to the three largest interior spaces. You don't have to give the dimensions unless you can find them easily. Sometimes you can on the internet or whatever research you're using, because what else would it be but the internet sources? If you have the dimensions of, let's say, the largest room is the lobby in a hotel, that's usually the case, or a ballroom. Anybody ever see the movie The Fugitive with Harrison Ford? Great film. It ends at a hotel I got to stay at twice where Al Capone used to hang out from the 20s. It's the first Hilton hotel. And yes, Paris Hilton has a permanent penthouse suite there, and it's empty most of the time. My daughter and I got to stay there twice on our visit to Chicago because she was, aware of the history of the city from me, of course. And inside that building, there are a lot of large rooms. So I had to actually ask, what are the largest spaces? Sometimes it's not obvious, but if it's on the internet, any building you're going to write about, probably you're going to get the photo from a website, and hopefully there is some research. All you have to do, you have to give the dimensions unless they're obvious and you have them at hand. You could just describe the largest space inside this building is the lobby or the ballroom or whatever it is. The second largest is the main conference room on the third floor or whatever. And then maybe the penthouse suite, which is the largest suite, is, I'm not making this up, that they keep it quiet, but everybody knows that Paris Hilton stays there when she's in town. That is the third largest, I think I confirmed that, of all the interior spaces at the Chicago Hilton. There's about 8 Hiltons in Chicago, at least, but the original one on Lake Michigan. So yeah, that's what you do, is you just identify the 3 largest spaces inside and what they are used for. And you don't have to give the dimensions. Then you've covered space. Now, if it's a skyscraper, you should be able to tell how many stories and how many feet tall it is, or any tall building, like a cathedral with a tower and stuff. Okay, we've covered everything, and we are actually right about where we should be. We didn't end early, but that's good. We didn't go over. Any questions before we take our break about anything we just covered in the last hour and 28 minutes? Okay. Well, let's take our well-needed breathing space, and I'm going to make sure that I hit pause. Now it says pause.
It says it's recording.
Yeah, it says
Okay.
recording for me too.
Thank you. That's very helpful. So apparently the exact way you hit it, that's probably what I did wrong in the afternoon class. I didn't hit it hard enough. I hit it once at the start. It was only a half session, one of those twice a week classes. So I thought that was enough, and I didn't notice, nor did I ask students. So thank you for your confirmation, so we don't lose the valuable recorded session for all of you to use as review, or for those who missed this class. Okay, so we are going to do screen sharing now for prehistoric art. And we are going to have a few new terms. And let's hide this thumbnail here and maximize this image. And then move that out of the way. Yeah, a little further. Okay, everybody can see this? The first slide? Yes, I assume.
Yes.
Yeah.
Good. It's always best to verify before. What was that saying the Russians supposedly had when Reagan was president? He used to use a lot, trust but verify. Well, don't assume, verify is my corollary for that, just to be safe. Thank you. All right, so on your syllabi, or syllabus as it is for each of you individually, look down to week 2, and here we only have 4. Like I said, we start slow. 4 must-know slides, but these, there's a high, I'm going to go ahead and tell you that I will do this every week, by the way, from now on. When a slide is so important that it definitely will not be cut from the study list when we review and cut the study list down by 40%. You see my note above week 2, which I told you about last week. So you can count on my doing that the review session before both the midterm and the final exams. So you want to be here for those sessions. But the point is that that some slides are so important, they just aren't ever cut from that slide list. And there's usually 2 or even sometimes 3 or 4 in any given topic that are that important. So I'm going to start with this one. The Hall of Bulls is one of those high priority slides. I'm definitely not cutting it off the slide list. It's a very important slide. So here we go. The title again, Hall, plural, of Bulls. The location, there's several of them in France, so you have to say the city, and just like it is on the syllabus, and the country, Lascaux, France. Of course, you have that in your syllabus. I'll spell it though. Lascaux, France. And the date, we don't put a little C in front of these because it's obvious that we don't know the exact date. It's so far back. So we just say 15,000 BC, or if you prefer BCE, either one will do for this class. So what does that tell us? This work of art is at least 17,000 years, or just say about 17,000 years old. But now you have your other handout. Remember, I said every class you should have not only the syllabus, but the list of terms to know. This will be the first one on tonight's list. We covered, remember last week, fresco and cherub. So the first one tonight, and that's prehistoric. It's pretty simple. This is a prehistoric cave painting, but let us define that term first before I give you the meaning. Okay, prehistoric is that period in any culture's history before written records were kept, period. I'll say it again. Prehistoric means that period in any culture's history before written records were kept, period. Just so you know, these are, I'm not trying to claim copyright protection here. I'm just telling you, these are not exactly the same as the ones in the glossary of your textbook. They're perfectly good there, but they're almost always longer and more complicated. I try to make them more concise for your sake and, other future students, because it's not necessary to get too long-winded, although some definitions you can't shorten them down. But this one is pretty straightforward. So I gave that now to everyone. I hope you all wrote it. Now let me ask, are there any prehistoric cultures in the world today that you can think of? I'm sure a couple of you must have thought of, over the years of your schooling and travels or whatever, watching media even. There's more than a few. Anybody?
South America, or maybe the Aborigines.
Yes, you could say that the native cultures, the indigenous tribes on the Amazon, many of them have chosen not to write down written records of their history or their current even events. So that could qualify as a prehistoric culture. Anybody think much further north towards the top of the planet?
Eskimos.
Yeah, and that's of course the old term. I still tend to use it, but the preferred term is Inuit. Either one will do for this class. But actually, if you're writing about it in a paper, you should probably use the more recent term, Inuit or Eskimo. Yeah,
I didn't know I was so out of it.
Yeah, well, that's fine. I mean, just like I said, BC and BCE depends on where you are in the world. But if you guys travel around, you'll see the majority of countries in the world today still use BC and AD, just because it's a commonly understood for centuries now designation. Okay, but let's get to the point about what other. Sorry, what? Sorry.
One more. This is Hall of Bulls.
Yes, that's right. That's the title, exactly that. And some of you probably already know that's actually not an accurate description of what we're looking at. The white animal is a bison, but don't get confused. Keep the title the way it is in Stockstead and the way it is in almost every other source. That's how it was named when it was found. Let's talk about the meaning in just a minute, but I just want to finish up with the fact that there are a lot of other prehistoric. I think you're talking about Australia, whoever it was that mentioned the Aborigines. Yes, they are by choice. It's not a pejorative. Some of you don't know what that word means, right? It's not any kind of criticism of it. It's just this choice that in this day and age, or for the last couple of centuries, certain cultures choose not to write down. They use oral. They keep records, but they're oral. Songs, stories, right? Poems, what have you, that they recite and pass on generation to generation, but they don't keep written records. That would qualify them as prehistoric. And some parts of Russia are like that. My daughter's home country, we adopted her from Russia. Where she's from is not like that. It's an island off the coast of Siberia. But if you go up into the northern edges of Siberia, some of the citizens of Russia just don't never wrote anything down, and they're not Inuit, but they're of Asian heritage, and they just don't write things down. So they would be qualified as prehistoric. Okay, let's get to the meaning of this. I already started, but let me rephrase. The very first fact under meaning, remember how to head your notes in two categories. So we're under meaning now, is usually what I start with. This is a prehistoric cave painting, which many historians believe is a hunting ritual painting. So it's a prehistoric cave painting, no debating on that, which many historians, actually most, you could even say most historians, believe is a hunting ritual scene. Well, what does that mean? Well, as you might know, if you've read ahead, as you should, of course, before each lecture in Stockstead, that this, if it is, this is the further explanation, is still taking notes under meaning, right? Of what that means, that a hunting ritual painting was something that was painted by a holy person. They were usually men that far back, but not always. So we just say shaman. It could be a man or a woman. A holy person or shaman, shaman. See, I used to put that as a definition, but that's getting too many words all at once. So we'll keep it simple. A shaman, in your notes, you would just write that word, or holy person, would either have painted it themselves or directed the painting of these animals in order to guarantee a successful hunt of those animals. That's what that means, a hunting ritual painting. They believe the shaman was their holy man or woman, or usually a man, and would have said, if we do this painting, maybe they just dictated or directed, however, the artist to actually paint it, but they could have actually painted it themselves, this shaman, over a long period of time. It would have taken them a while, right? And so the goal of that, the purpose of a hunting ritual painting, is to guarantee a successful hunt of these animals. Now, why did they hunt these animals? Well, I think you already know, but if it isn't obvious, and just for review sake for the final, midterm, it won't be on the final, but it has a high possibility of being on the midterm. You should write this, unless you've already taken notes in another class about what life was like in prehistoric times. There was no farming. None. They didn't know farming this far back. And they couldn't always depend on gathering. The gatherer cultures, of course, which were like the Miwok. We're going to talk about them, that occupied in prehistoric or pre-European times the Bay Area, parts of the Bay Area. They were gatherers. That's possible in a warm climate, not in Europe, where they had ice ages, right? And they had winters and, obviously cold weather every year. So they could not, they didn't have any hunting, and they could not depend on gathering fruits and berries. So they had to hunt for survival, for food. But what else could they have used these animals for besides food? Anybody?
Shelter, clothing.
Clothing, absolutely. Well, shelter.
Tools.
That's a good point. No one mentioned that before. Yeah, you could make part of it. Yeah, what else? Yeah, tools. Yeah, excellent. Yeah, tools.
Travel.
Well, that's if they didn't kill them. Assuming they hunted them, they're probably going to kill them, right? So, keeping within that context, they first would have had to eat the flesh. I mean, there's no way around that. Sorry, PETA people, but I am an animal lover. But back then, survival, it did for humans, early prehistoric humans, their survival depended on successful hunts. It just did, otherwise they would have died of starvation very early on in their lives, and there wouldn't have been any future generation. So they had to hunt them for food, but they also used parts of their bodies for clothing, right? And if you didn't write this now, you should. Tools, weapons, and I'm glad the fourth category no one's mentioned before, so that's a good point, is also sometimes for shelter. Like hides could be used to make some kind of a tent-like structure, although most of them dwelled in caves because the caves could shelter them more from the cold weather in the winter, at least. But some of the prehistoric cultures, of course, were using animal hides for some parts of the year or certain times of the year when it was warmer, for temporary shelter. Okay, so that's one theory, and then the other part of the meaning is an alternate theory. You can say another theory, just keep it simple, or just say some historians believe that these animals were painted by this tribe. It was some kind of tribe. That's the correct term for this type of society, right? That these animals, some historians believe they were painted in order to show the respect and admiration that they had for the strength, speed, and beauty of these animals. In other words, I'll repeat that some historians believe the main reason for these cave paintings was to show the respect and admiration that the this tribe had for the strength, speed, and beauty of these animals. Well, now that's nice. Could be, but is that the primary reason? I have my doubts. I'm a little skeptical. They were struggling day to day for survival, just to live to be 40. Most people didn't make it much past that because it was such a brutal environment, of course, and so difficult to survive. So for them to make that the primary purpose, it seems more likely that both could be true. See, so, but the primary purpose, most historians believe, is very likely to have been a hunting ritual painting for the reasons I just gave. And then maybe secondarily, it could have also been you can't say a tip of the hat. I don't think, well, maybe they had hats then. I guess you could just say their gesture of respect towards these animals because they did admire them. And the proof of that is how they portrayed them. So now we're going to switch to the formal analysis. They portrayed them with great, careful observations of detail. And so what techniques did they use to portray these animals? Well, let's start with the bison. Do you see any simulated texture, like maybe between the horns, or how about on the nose? Anybody see any simulated texture there? No? Yes?
Pretty obvious shading.
Yeah, okay, I know it is. I just, every so often it's helpful to hear someone.
It looks like maybe there's fur or hair or something that's on the upper part of the head, perhaps.
Yes, especially between the horns. I think it's fairly realistic. Remember, they were using vegetable dyes on a stone wall with, in the winter. Certainly, this took months to create. Freezing temperatures part of the time. It's pretty impressive. I think this is a minor masterpiece, or maybe not so minor. Considering of all the cave paintings, it's the most famous one. There's a reason, because it is the most detailed. But I forgot one other fact about the meaning, and you could add this in the margin above the second category, which we're focused on now, of formal elements. This is a part of a series of cave paintings that runs for over 200 feet along the walls of a cave in southern France. I forgot to say that. That's the context. I'll say it again. This is one of a series of paintings that runs along the walls of it's actually a complex of caves, really. It's not one cave. So a complex of caves in southern France. Lascaux is in the south of France. By the way, it was founded in World War II, and it was the Nazis that publicized. Can you believe that? You just don't write that unless you want to, for some reason, or write a paper. But yeah, it was during World War II when the Nazis occupied France. And so the first scientists that studied this were French occupied scientists who were working with or for the German occupiers. But soon after the war, it became so famous that tourists go there now. And they started limiting, before COVID, they started limiting, don't write this, but because tourists' breath, I know you're going to laugh at that, but tourists breathing on this or any other work of art on a wall, any kind of, this isn't a fresco, remember, it's not wet plaster, it's painted with animal or vegetable dyes directly on a stone wall. But any kind of work on a wall can fade and be almost destroyed by too much moisture. And what more common source of moisture would there be than 1 million tourists a year going onto the surface of this? So you can't go in unless you have special permission now, but it used to be open to the tourists. Okay, back to the formal elements. So we have simulated texture. It's limited. I see it in the horse too. I think that looks like horsehair on the belly at least, and maybe even on the back. That maybe some would say even in the entire light brown section of the horse's flank. So there could be some similar texture on the brown horse, the largest horse, on the main body, you could say it that way. And there's definitely similar texture on the tufts, I would call them tufts of hair, thick hair between the horns on the bull's head. We'll call it the bull, even though it's really a bison. And this is nose leather. Anybody that has a cat or a dog at home, we have one of each, and they don't like each other. That's called nose leather. And I think that's let's get up close. In fact, I keep forgetting I can do that. That's really quite amazingly sophisticated way of depicting a simulated texture for the limited tools that they had at their disposal for these works of art. It's pretty impressive, I think. And then we have rhythm. Is there rhythm in this?
Yes.
Yeah, everywhere. I mean, you got the smaller horses, or maybe they're just a different, well, then they could be a smaller breed or species, actually. I can't remember. Horses, are they like cats and dogs or breeds? I don't remember. Anyway, I'm not a horse person, but smaller horses, they could be a different species, I think, right? But it could also just be the artist just wasn't trying to show space realistically. We're going to get to the one technique for space in a minute, and you probably already know what it is. But before we get to that, let's just say the rhythm is the repeated shapes of the bodies of the horses and of the, these are reindeer, right? Or just deer, you could say, but they're probably reindeer. And their horns and heads create similar shapes. And then the bull's horns, of course. And even the hair between them creates rhythm. So there's lots of rhythm. Is this, look carefully, mostly stable, dynamic, or equally stable and dynamic?
Dynamic.
It's almost empty, exactly. Yeah, you guys are getting the idea pretty well already this early.
I'm gonna go ahead and
no
say
straight line in it. I don't see.
I'm gonna say it's not balanced too.
Well, now I'm glad you brought it up, because you anticipated my next question was, is it balanced? I would guess that yes. Yeah, most people would say that. And I would agree with you, except for the fact that if you drew the line here, right, and you get 2/3 or so of the largest horse's body, and these two other horses behind this line or I should say, but to the left, you could make the case that it's roughly balanced, but that's a matter of interpretation. Again, that's up to you.
I'm gonna go ahead and say that the mass on the right half is much larger than the mass
Yeah,
on the left
yeah,
half.
it mostly, yes. I wouldn't argue with you on that one. But it is true. Yeah, right. And you could say why? Because the bison is rather large. We only see part of the bison's body, but it's a huge chunk of their body we see. And then the largest horse, right, is mostly to the right. And at least depends on where you draw the line, but yes, you'd have, because there's no question that when you add the horns up here and there's nothing in this here. By the way, that's missing. The wall of the cave originally had this, I don't know what it is, some kind of mineral deposit on it that made the stone look white. That's not plaster. It may look like it. So some of that chipped away and made the yellow color here. But there was probably nothing here that we know of in this section. In any case, now there isn't. So all you have to write about is what you see in the photos or the slides when you're on, when they're on the screen and you're being tested, you write about what you see. So yeah, I would go with that. It is mostly unbalanced, or really basically unbalanced. How about top to bottom though? That's a little harder. You do a line, let's say right here. It's not so obvious.
Yeah.
I think it's roughly balanced that way, but anybody disagree? There's no right or wrong on this kind of a work of art. It's, close, but I would say roughly balanced if you were to draw the line roughly around where the brown horse's belly is and the bottom of the bison's or bull's nose. And then you'd say there's these three horses here and this reindeer, and most of the larger or darker reindeer are below the median line. And you can make the case it's roughly balanced. It's harder to tell, and I accept whatever you think you see if you just describe why. Again, okay, what about space? What technique for space is used here, if any? It's pretty obvious when you really look. There's only, I'll give you a clue, one technique. What would that be? We covered it just a few minutes ago.
For space? Oh,
somebody said it. What? Go ahead.
yeah. Is it the diminishing line?
Well, that's actually, you're talking about register line, which there aren't any lines drawn, and diminishing size. There are two techniques, but you know what? That's not a bad guess. But I don't think so, because they didn't have. We know from seeing all the paintings. In fact, just this set of paintings in the 200 feet, there's like dozens of these sections of paintings throughout that cave complex. There's no consistency to it, so they didn't know that technique, even though it might look like this. Here, let me just, this reindeer is meant to be further away, but we can't say that for sure.
Right.
Much more like definite. I mean, not likely, much clearer than that. The only technique for space we can definitely say that is used here is, anybody want to?
Overlapping.
Exactly. Yeah, that's all you got to write. Say there are no other clearly used techniques for space other than overlapping. And what overlaps what? Well, really, it's mostly just the brown horse overlaps the bison. Maybe a little bit the head of one of the smaller horses, because I think they're supposed to be either younger horses or a different breed running closer to the viewer. In any case, that's how it would appear. And so there's a little bit of overlapping of the two horses and a very obvious bit of overlapping used for the two largest objects, the largest horse and the bison. What about color? Let's call this black, because it really is. It depends on your computer screen, but some places it looks almost brownish black. Let's call the darker, smaller horses across the bottom and the largest reindeer is black. Well, we know that's neutral. So what are there any warm colors? Should be obvious. Somewhere in here.
The horse. Maybe?
Yeah, the biggest horse. Yes, the brown horse. I just call it brown horse. That's an earth tone. That is clearly warm. And then the cool color, because it's a contrast, it is cool. White by itself is neutral, but or black and white. So if it's just the bison's head, it would all be neutral. But when the contrast side by side, warm colors are in the same, work of art. Next to white, the white is cool. So the white color on the bison's head or bull's head, you can use either word, is a cool color. So, and then it's neutral on the black painted horses and the larger reindeer, and warm again on this smaller reindeer. Okay, and then is there outline? That's not as obvious, but actually it isn't too hard to tell if you look closely at the two largest objects. Do you see any outline?
Yeah.
Yeah, bold.
Around the bull for sure.
Absolutely, around the bull's head and neck, and then around the horse, I would say. It fades a bit here, ironically, but it's there around the horse's rump, and I'd say the belly. So yes, there is some bold outline, not on the other, they're more silhouettes, all the other animals. Okay, and so that's enough for now. I think we're not going to do always all 9 elements on each. Well, let me think of one other. Modeling. Yeah, is there any modeling? Well, let's get up close here. See, now this is a matter, it's open to interpretation. I think there is a little bit, but it could be just different color. But I don't know any horses that have, do they? Their bellies are, yeah, I know Palomino, is it? That my daughter knows all the breeds from all the, videos she's watched. I don't know if you call that modeling because I don't think it's a natural coloring effect. So if it's a deliberately different, darker color of the belly, it would be. But there is, I think, no question, there's modeling on at least just one small area, and that is the nose or nose leather of the bison or bull. It's got some variations of shading, and so that qualifies as modeling. Okay, let's move on to the next must know. This next one on your syllabus is, well, I give you Stockstad's title in 90-some% of the time, except when it clashes with almost every other art historian's source. And this one is almost in that category, but I'll go with her title because we're still starting out and I want to make it simple and clear cut for you at the beginning. And not as complex as it might be on some of the later slides. So we'll use her title, Woman, right? First word from Willendorf. That's Willendorf.
I just realized something. I think you sent me the wrong syllabus.
Well, some people didn't actually clarify which class they were in. I had a lot of that. I'm swamped.
Oh, that's might be my fault. I'm like, none of these are lining up.
Okay. Tell you what, the good news is that we have time to you have time to recuperate with my assistance.
I'm just writing it down anyways.
Shoot me an email and either tonight or tomorrow, certainly before 3 o'clock at the latest, if not sooner. I probably earlier afternoon, or if not tonight, I will send you, if you specify which section you're in and which class. Is that the only thing? Because the other handouts are the same, right?
Yeah. I was just like, oh, maybe that first slide's not on here. And then
okay, but you're writing the titles, right? So you still get the notes, but don't want you to have to do that every week and not know which.
Okay, so I'm writing these down anyway. So what was this one called again?
Woman, sure, I didn't quite finish the title, so everyone now, it's 3 words. Woman from Willendorf. That's Willendorf. That's a town in, the location is usually the country in our syllabus, Austria. Arnold Schwarzenegger's home. In fact, he even actually grew up near this site. He said that once in an interview. 22,000 BC or BCE. Well, that makes this the oldest work of art we're going to see this semester, by far. So guess what? It's prehistoric. But what is it? Well, it's an amulet. And don't confuse that with something you make with 3 eggs. Not that kind of amulet. Here's the definition. It's spelled completely differently, so you should have no problem avoiding any confusion. It's on your 4th down on your list of terms to know. Now, I hope that's the right handout for you, right? That because
Yeah,
yeah. Oh, good. So that's strange how the two got mixed up. That's probably 2 separate contexts you sent me or something. Questions. Amulet is A-M-U-L-E-T. A-M-U-L-E-T. And the amulet is an object that can be carried in the hand of an adult human being. I know it sounds odd, but this is the best way to define it in a single sentence. I'll start it over again. An amulet is an object that can be carried in the hand, as in single, right, one hand, in the hand of an adult human being, comma, which grants that person magic powers, period, which grants that person magic powers. This is no question. Oh, yes, there's always debates. Some things, there's occasionally so much evidence that you don't have any debate over the meaning. But with prehistoric art, we don't have any written records, remember? So we can't be sure. But I almost always start out that way. Most historians believe this is a fertility object. That is a particular kind of amulet. And there's a name for that historians have given them for centuries. Venus, who is, you don't have to write this, but some of you know, we'll get to her later, the ancient Greek and Roman god of, or goddess of love, right? So I'll say it again, that most historians believe that this is a fertility object or a particular kind of amulet that most historians label Venus. So if you look it up, you're going to see much more evidence or whatever website info on it under the title Venus from Willendorf. That's how I studied it. That's how a lot of my current students even have. But in Stockstead, she prefers the word woman, and there's a reason for that, because she doesn't quite agree with the majority of historians. So what do most historians think? I just told you that it's a fertility object. Well, what does that mean? Well, when children were about to be either conceived, some historians think even at birth, but certainly at the beginning of the cycle of procreation or recreation, they might need help, perhaps, with conception to have a healthy child that would grow all the way to a live birth, right? So a shaman might come to that. Well, where else would it be but a cave, right? Because prehistoric times in Europe, they were living in caves. So a shaman might come to the cave of a couple where the woman was trying to become pregnant for some reason, or was going soon to, and or even give the husband or wife, probably the wife, an amulet that they might just keep inside their cave, right, their area of the cave, and it would supposedly grant the power to make sure that the woman had a successful pregnancy, became pregnant and gave birth to a live, healthy child. There is a corollary to that. It could also have been used to ensure the safe birth of a healthy child at the end of pregnancy. There is some evidence for the latter. And why would that be something other than a doula? Because we know now, there were doulas, or midwife. Those words to me are almost synonymous, but I know there's a slight difference. Just someone there, usually a woman, to help the woman during childbirth, help her through it. And that would not necessarily be a shaman. So what if a separate person came? Why would they be there? Why would they even need someone other than a midwife or a doula? Anybody know why? To guarantee the healthy birth of the child. Because of what was life like for that period of human history, prehistoric times. Was it a safe, secure, risk-free environment for giving birth?
They're just there to keep the wolves out of the cave.
Well, that's an odd guess. I've never heard that before. It could be. I've never heard that, but that's not likely, at least not what the historians mostly think. They just say it this way, that infant mortality was immense. Most historians have estimated through all kinds of genetic and other research and the evidence from these caves that the rate of infant mortality, meaning children born and dying within a few weeks, if not days after birth, or at birth, being born, stillborn, meaning right, dead, is after as soon as they came out of the womb. In other words, it's called.
But how would another person there who doesn't have any medical training make a difference?
Let me finish, and I'll answer your question. I promise. That if that is the case, that 1/3 of almost all children died in infancy. That's a huge. I mean, we consider it a tragedy if 3 or 4% or 5% at most in modern developed, quote unquote, whatever you want to call them, advanced, with modern healthcare. That's a high rate. That's unacceptable. And there's, obviously all kinds of things that could be done. So I'll repeat that. The purpose of this could have been two things, many historians believe. If it's a fertility object, the first use would be to guarantee, for that family, that couple, that, mother to be, that she would get pregnant and have a successful live birth of a healthy child. The other purpose could be at the end of the pregnancy during childbirth to, you could say ward off the wolves, but it's more symbolic, to prevent infant mortality, which was so common that, can you imagine 1 out of every 3 children dying before they get to be even a month old or even a week old? That's a high rate of it. So for this tribe to survive, they felt they needed the power of an amulet, and a shaman might be there for that purpose. Now, the doula would probably be the person who actually helped if there was one. Now, not all these cultures had the midwife concept, but we know some of them did in prehistoric times because there's evidence of that in some of their relics and artwork. But even if they had a doula, the doula might or might not be. Sometimes they'd be doubly trained, as a shaman and a midwife or a doula. That could be, but usually there were 2 different roles. And so that's one theory. What's the other? Finish up on the meaning. Well, Stockstead believes this one, and many historians do, but it's a minority. They think that it's an image of a general or generic. Either word will do this. It's pretty much synonymous. A general or generic image of a female, period. Of just some undistinguished, not specifically identified female with no particular purpose or, magic powers, in which case it wouldn't be an amulet at all, right? It would just be a stone carving.
A prehistoric Playboy magazine?
Well, it could be that, but you know what? There's too much visual evidence in many historians, and I studied this piece back in college. I had to write a paper about it. The emphasis on the reproductive parts is very obvious. The breast, minimizing, look at the arms, they're almost non-existent. They're tiny little like frog-like arms. And the vagina, and of course there's no face, no human features on the head at all, not ears, nothing. So why would you do that if it's supposed to be even a general or generic portrait of a woman? Wouldn't you at least give it some recognizable human features on the head, on the face, and not just emphasize the breasts and the reproductive areas? That's why most historians think it was a Venus or a fertility object, a particular kind of amulet, meant for the reasons I already gave you. So that's the debate that rages, but it's a matter of interpretation, and no one knows for sure because there are no written records. Okay, let's do a formal analysis. What color? Well, it depends on your computer screen, but I think you can all see that this is a gray stone. So what is that? Cool, warm, or warm color? Remember, I gave you a list of that before the break. Is this cool or warm?
Neutral.
Actually, you have a point. You could say that, but when it's just gray by itself without black and white gradations of gray in between, then you'd call it cool. Yeah, just like you can say white is neutral or cool. So I would accept that if you put that on your paper. But more commonly, art historians or art critics would say it's cool. It's a cool gray stone. Stone is usually cool colors when it's gray and off white, right? And of course, marble can have sometimes warm colors in it, or if it's white, then it's considered a cool color. But if you said neutral, I wouldn't dispute that, because you could think of it that way. But cool is the more common way to see this. Cool gray stone. And then what about the texture? Well, I don't see any simulated texture here.
That's real texture.
It's exactly real, and now it's been handled by people, from the archaeologists who found it to whoever collected it, and the museum curators, and maybe even who knows how many people. So it might look smooth in this photo, I understand that, but it was originally a rough real stone texture, and so that's all you got to say. There are no simulated textures in this piece. It's a rough real stone texture. Exactly right. And there is carved line here, isn't there? Especially between the legs. And what little bit there is of the hand, there's some hints of hand fingers, aren't there? So there, and then this, what is this? A giant wool sock cap is what it looks like.
Weird.
Yeah, if you ever grew up in the Midwest, like in Chicago in the winter, you pull those things down over your face as you go out the door, because every breath is painful. Your lungs hurt to breathe 20 degrees below zero air, and it's that cold on your way to school a lot of times in the winter in parts of the Midwest and the East Coast. So that's not obviously what the artist intended. It's some generic pattern. So there's no realistic attempt, to use realistic textures or simulated textures at all. It's the real texture of the stone. And the carved line is really minimal. It's just say it creates the geometric pattern along the head. And then you could say, I guess, the arms, and including, of course, the hands, and then between the legs. So there is some carved line. Is this balanced? Well, it's a human figure, so we kind of covered that. But
So
yeah, totally. It's symmetrical. It's an intact human body, distorted and exaggerated as the parts are. They're evenly divided, at least roughly evenly, between left and right. And if you draw the line across around the belly button there, or just above it, it's roughly the same mass or area top to bottom. It's a single mass, by the way. There's no larger and smaller mass. It's one single object. So that makes the job of analyzing mass easy when you're writing about, I think, we had that question before the break, a single object, like an abstract sculpture or a simplistic painting where it's just one object. Then that's easy. You just say there is no larger or smaller mass. It's a single mass.
I have a question
Yeah.
about the 9 elements. When we're like asked to review something, are we supposed to always use all 9 elements?
Yes, good question. Everybody hear that? Yeah, I'm glad you asked. I think I hinted at that, but I don't think I will next week reiterate and emphasize that. But now that you're asking it, it is a good point to have everyone remember. And when you start writing your papers, you want to have your list of 9 elements in front of you, because all I said was you should have that list and you should look it down to make sure. But the answer to your question is yes, absolutely. If you want an A, yes, you need to analyze all 9. And again, if some of them aren't present in certain works of art, there aren't, some elements, you need to just write that out in a sentence, like there is no, it's only real texture in this work of art, this building. There's no simulated texture like that. Yeah, so you have to write about all 9 to get
Sure.
grade. Yep. Okay, let's wrap this one up, because the next 2 we'll have a little more to say about them, especially Stonehenge. And then I have a little story to tell you about what not to do if you ever go to Stonehenge. Okay, what else? Let's see. Is it stable or dynamic? Do you see any straight lines here?
I'd say dynamic.
I don't see a single straight line, not on the breast, on the little spindly arms, on the head, the legs, the feet. It's all curved lines, so that would make it totally dynamic, of course. And how about space? Is there any technique for space? Well, let's get a little closer again. Well, yeah, there's overlapping. The arms overlap the breast, but that's about it. Otherwise, it's real space, and you would want to add that if you're writing a paper, or even if it's on the exam and you have less time on the exam to have to write about the analysis. On the exams, you only have to write about 6 of the elements of the 9 elements to get full credit, because you have less time. And it's open book, remember that, open note. But nonetheless, on a paper, you're going to want to write in specific detail as much as at least 2 sentences on average for each element. So you would say on this, in terms of space, there's only one technique for space. That's the overlapping of where the arms overlap the breast. However, it is an object in real space, which is 4.5 inches tall. So that's it. Then you have covered space. That's the height of this piece. Or you could say a little under 5 inches. All right, let's move on.
I have a question.
Yeah, sure. On that object? Do you want me to
Yeah,
go back to it? Okay, yeah, sure, I will.
for
Wait, go to that other picture.
The other one is a different one. I don't want to confuse you.
Oh,
That's
okay,
a
but it's
different.
quite
It's
similar.
in the
All right.
in the same grave site or cave or whatever they found these pieces. There were multiple images of these fertility objects, or maybe they're just images of women. Please go ahead with the other person with the question.
you may have touched on this and I might have missed it. Would you consider this balanced from top to bottom
Yes.
as well?
Yes, I
Okay.
would. Yeah, I kind of just did it quickly with this arrow. So that if you use this roughly where a belt would come, the midline across the waist, it's roughly balanced. Yes, roughly, not exactly, but pretty close. Yeah, most human bodies you would say that about, right? If they're intact. And this does have both arms and both legs, right? Anyway, let's go to the next one. This won't take as long as the others because Stonehenge is really important. We don't want to rush through that, and we want to end, if we can, right around 9:15 or maybe 9:20 at the very least, depending on how many questions you have. And then I'll stick around, as always, to answer any questions after the last slide is done. Okay, so this is the third must-know slide. You notice I didn't say on Woman from Willendorf or this one that they are extra important. You know, you could use a little asterisk, right, or star or check or whatever, you know, little symbol you want next to the slides on the syllabus is how I would do that, or your notes. As to the ones that are so important, I definitely will not cut them for the test, meaning you will need to study them before the midterm. And the first one was, these last two aren't. The last one, absolutely. Stonehenge, no way I would cut that from a study list. But we'll get to that in a few minutes. So here we go. The third slide, or must know that you should take notes, is from the syllabus, is the bison. Just one word, B-I-S-O-N. Location, we just give you the country, France. And the date of this, here we have the little C. I'm going to give you guys a break. You don't have to remember those. Well, actually, they're on your syllabus anyway, and it's an open book test. But you could just dispense with writing it. It's an Italian symbol for about or approximately. We don't know the exact year, in other words. So historians always use that. And since the textbook does, I put it in. But if you want to, if it's on the test and you had this slide, you could just write 13,000 BC or BCE. Okay, so what is this? This is a piece of bone, possibly bison bone. I don't know what kind. I don't remember reading if it is, but in any case, it's a carved image of a bison that is about 4.5 to 5 inches long. And so it's small enough to be carried in the hand of an adult human being. Could it be an amulet to guarantee a successful hunt? Because they hunted these animals quite a lot. You know, one bison would feed a whole cave full of people for, you know, a few weeks, right? I mean, they're huge animals, at least the biggest ones would. So that could be, that's one theory, that it was a kind of an amulet, which was a kind of hunting ritual amulet, meaning to try and guarantee a successful hunt of a bison. But there's another theory, and on this one, I side with the minority of historians that I've read, which is that maybe it has nothing to do with trying to kill these animals or hunt them. It could be that this artist was one of the first we have any, if this is true, any example of artwork from, who is just capturing the state of mind of an animal as he observed it, either in discomfort or maybe just licking itself. But it looks like the tongue is sticking out, or some historians think, no, that's a gash or a wound. Possibly it escaped a hunting party somewhere. Anyway, the artist may, just say there are two theories. I already gave the first one about it being a hunting ritual amulet. And another is that it could just be a portrait of an animal in its natural setting observed by this artist. And the animal's responding, this bison is responding to some kind of either injury or irritation. You know, if it's an irritation, that might be just an itch, right? Or some kind of skin, you know, discomfort, or it could be worse. It could be actually licking a wound. That we can't know. But if that theory is true, that makes this piece way ahead of almost all other prehistoric art, because very few artists would have taken the time to portray an animal and the kind of, you know, physical, right, reactions an animal would have to a non-hunting situation, because most of the contact they had with these animals was to kill them, of course, for survival, which we already covered. So those are the two theories. It could be just a portrait of a bison who's dealing with some discomfort or pain or an injury, with no attempt to try and capture or kill the animal, or it could be a hunting ritual amulet. We can't know for sure, but it's
Well,
definitely
it's,
prehistoric.
it's an amulet or art for art's sake.
Yes, you could say it that way. Yeah. Yeah, that's a pretty
And
good
there
way
was
to put
still probably some critic judging him.
it. Yeah, it could be. Yeah. Oh, I like this piece because I think the latter is true in my mind because I sense a personality here.
No, it's really good.
Yeah, look at the detail on the nose. So here, let's do the form analysis. It definitely has good simulated texture on the head only, because the rest of it is the smooth. In this case, it's a bone. Well, it's somewhere between smooth and rough. Parts of the bone, of course, down here, the leg, at least that leg, is rough. So it's real, some smooth, some rough texture of bone texture. So that's real, but it's clearly realistic simulated texture on the horn, the hair on the head, the eyes, even the eyeball, the nose. It's quite well done. I mean, for something this old, it's amazing. There's the rhythm, of course, of the two horns and the hair and the two legs. So there is rhythm. It's a single mass. There's no larger and smaller mass. It is both. It has one technique for space. Almost all prehistoric art only knew one technique, and that was overlapping. The head overlaps the body, and the horns overlap the head. But it's also the real space of about a 5-inch long piece of bone. So it's both real and space with the technique of overlapping from the artist. And then we have, let's see, the color is a cool gray. Yeah, I mean, actually, I don't know, on your screens, someplace I've seen it almost looks like it's a lighter, almost yellowish gray, but not in. Yeah, I've seen this piece in the museum. I forget which museum it's in Europe. And pieces like it, it's usually a cool gray color of the bone. And then there's carved line, of course, everywhere to create the simulated texture. And I would say there's no technique for modeling except the effect is there around the eyeball and the horns. It's the lighting from the museum that creates it, though. So it's not exactly a technique of modeling, but it is the effect of it is created by the shadows. Because, of course, obviously before, when it was first carved, it would only be the sunlight that would create those shadows. So the artist may have thought of that as a way of emphasizing the details on the head. And then you could qualify that as a kind of early modeling technique. Okay, let's see. I already mentioned the rhythm, right? I think I did. Oh, and it's dynamic. I don't see anything stable about it. Okay, now we get to, I mean, the first and last slides are both so important they won't be cut. But if I had to pick one that was the most important, it would certainly be this slide or this work of art. I'm going to show you 3 views. And if it's on the exam, we are going to focus, it will be, if it's on the midterm, I mean, we'll focus on the notes for the meaning and the formal analysis entirely on this slide because it's the best view. These are all professional views. I've been there 3 times, and I'll tell you what it's like to go there in a few minutes. But let's talk about the meaning first. The title, of course, is Stonehenge. That's one word, right? Stone, H-E-N-G-E. Stonehenge, Salisbury, England. Yeah, it's spelled the same as the steak, S-A-L-I-S-B-U-R-Y, England. There's a reason why. Why don't they just say England? Because there are dozens of Stonehenges. Stonehenge means a circle made of stones. That's all it means. Or stones arranged in a circle. Not a complete circle, obviously. It never was complete. But we'll talk about, everything about how it was made or the theories, and they're only theories. Because this is prehistoric. We have no written records to know how they made it. We'll get to that in a minute. Let's then do the date. Well, that's hard because A, it's prehistoric, and B, it was built over several centuries or many. In fact, some think over 2,000 years in different phases. All we can say is that most historians agree that the majority, if not all of this site was completed. Most, just say most or all of this site, meaning the stones in their circles, was probably complete by 2000 BC or BCE. Now in Europe, that wasn't prehistoric, right? Ancient Egypt was really an advanced society by then, and ancient Greece was getting started then. Babylon was well on its way. There were big cities, but not in the British Isles. They were still prehistoric. So again, this is a prehistoric site. Oh, raise your hand. Yeah. Sorry, let me see if I can do it this way because I usually am used to the, I don't see, where is it? Is that you here? Yeah. Okay. I think asked to unmute. I didn't mean to mute anybody. People have been talking. Sorry.
I was going to ask you a quick question
Sure,
regarding.
please go ahead. That's what we're here for. Yes, what?
You said that the reason it's Stonehenge, Salisbury, England, is because there's many Stonehenges throughout
Yes.
England.
Yes.
I've just heard the word Stonehenge by itself many times. When people say like, I went to Stonehenge, are they?
That's what they mean. Yeah, it's like there are other examples. I don't want to get too sidetracked here, but just you're raising a valid point. When people think of the word Stonehenge, this is what they're thinking of. And it's like 95% of the time, that's what the historians are talking about too. But to be absolutely accurate, historically, there are a few dozen other sites. They're nowhere near as big as this or as much of it is preserved. They're all, decimated. I mean, none of them are intact. They're so old, right? Thousands of years old. So to answer your question, yeah, it's safe to just keep that association as that this is Stonehenge. The Stonehenge that people mean when they use that word, but technically speaking, it's not the only one. But you don't have to mention that in your notes unless you want to. Okay, let's get to the meaning of it. This is a prehistoric site in southern England, okay, which consists of 3 concentric circles of stones. And they were erected by the Britons. That's Britons. They weren't, the modern island name of the island is Britain, right, with an AI. I'll say it again, Britons. That's the word for them. Don't say the Druids. That's a later made up name. These were the Britons, Britons, and a prehistoric culture that occupied southern Britain. The British Isles, you could say the southern British Isles or southern England. Just keep it simple. It is don't want to get complicated, but if you know your geography, England is just part of the British Isles. There's Scotland, Wales, and Ireland, and then of course England. So we'll say southern England. This is a prehistoric site consisting of 3 concentric circles of stone. But that begs the question: what was the purpose of it? Well, I show you this view first because some of you are saying, "Where's the 3rd circle?" This was the first and oldest circle. It was the outer circle, and only a few parts of it survived, like this stone and this one, right? And I think that's about it, maybe a part of this one. So most of the outer circle is gone, but the base of the stones, you can see the white marks there, underground still survive. So we know that the oldest part of this series of 3 circles was the outer circle. And there are several theories, but let's keep it simple. 3 main theories about the purpose of this site. Many historians believe the outer circle was used as a burial ground for the leading members of that tribe, that group of Britons who built it. As a ritual, actually, they even say burial ground. In other words, they had ceremonies, for their holy men and or women and for their rulers when they died, and then buried them somewhere, not under the stones, but somewhere near the stones. Well, this far back, there's no remains of human beings. But it turns out recently archaeologists have found evidence. Don't ask me what it is. We don't have time for the details, but just say there is evidence to show that the outer circle was originally used, at least it was originally created, as a ritual burial site for leading members of that tribe. Okay, what's the second? Let's go now to the next view. Possible use of this. Okay, well, that could be that it was an observatory for the Britons so they could measure the seasons. Well, that also, there's no doubt that very little doubt that they consciously designed it that way. Why do we say that? Because now this stone looks like it's fallen down, but I've been there 4 times. Let me take another look. Okay, let's just look at this picture then. That stone, which the last photos I've seen of it as recently as, PBS documentaries just a few months ago, I'm sure it's still standing. One of the few outer stones is standing is called a heel stone. So let me just describe this and then I'll answer your question, which is where the sun rises directly, some of you know this already, above that stone, that heel stone from the outer circle, every year on the first day of summer without fail. And then it shines right through these tallest stones. The tallest ones are in the middle circle and would have hit an altar if there ever was an altar. And yes, most historians think there was in the middle. That can't be an accident or a coincidence. There's too much planning involved in arranging these circles of stones that way. So I'll say it again, that the second purpose of this, now most historians agree, was to measure the seasons. Because if you know the first day of summer, then you can, count the number of days before and after to know when spring starts, when you plant, and when fall starts, when you harvest, so it would measure the seasons. That would make it a outdoor stone observatory or astronomical observatory. No, that's stretching it because they didn't have telescopes, obviously, but they could measure the seasons.
How about a calendar?
Yeah, actually, that's a very good point. Actually, that might be a better word to use. I've seen, the other word as often, or if not more often. So you could say a large outdoor stone calendar. Sure, you could, or an instrument to measure the seasons, or observatory. But some historians do think they use the stones at different times of the night in some rituals as well to measure the time of year by the stars. But that's a little less clear. We just know for a fact, definitely you want to know that fact, that this is clearly a site where the sun rises every year for thousands of years exactly in the same way, over the top of this heel stone at sunrise, and then through these two large upright stones to what would have been an altar. And then the third purpose would be that it was a large outdoor religious ritual site, a large outdoor religious ritual site. Because it's not a building, obviously, but it isn't a piece of architecture. So it's enclosed space in that the circles enclose space within each circle, right? But it's not enclosed like a building would be, where there's a roof and walls, but it still qualifies as architecture, no question. All right, and then the other part of the meaning is, how did they build it? We don't know. There are theories I don't want to waste a lot of time on because we're getting close to when we need to. I think we'll go to about 9:22, okay? And then I'll stick around for questions. So I'll just say this. The leading theory is that the stones were carved from, well, this is a fact. I mean, this is not a theory. The stones came from mountains over 200 miles away. I think it's 220. Just say over 200 miles away in Wales. This is not even England, on the coast of the British Isles. So just say a range of mountains where these stones came. There's been evidence to prove that that's where these stones were carved. And then they had to be transported over 200 miles. They didn't have the wheel, right? These people didn't farm. Yes, they did. I misspoke. They farmed, sorry, but they didn't keep written records. That's why we don't know. I meant to say they had no written records. They were farming, or they wouldn't have need to know, of course, the seasons. That's why they built almost all historians agree. This was meant to measure the seasons for farming purposes. But they didn't have written records, and they didn't have the wheel. We do know that. So how did they get those stones? Well, they could have floated them on barges on a river, but the nearest river is 20 miles away. So then who knows how they got them? They could have dragged them. They had oxen. They could have used oxen. We don't know. How did they erect them? That is open to all kinds of interpretation. Some theories as silly as the ancient Egyptians came and showed them how.
No,
That's silly. We would know. The Egyptians kept records on everything,
they
like the
they
Romans.
got contractors from Easter Island.
Yeah, right. Or Merlin with his magic wand. I believe there are actual books on it. Don't write that stuff down. Those are poppycock theories. That's how the British would say it. Total poppycock. Okay, so just silly. But the serious theories involve, some kind of inclined plane to slide them into place where the holes for the base was done. But you don't have to write that. You could just say, no one knows for sure. The only thing we know is that the stones came from over 200 miles away, and they would have probably been transported by a combination of across floated down a river and then dragged to the site. That's good enough. And then the last thing to say is our last definition. And boy, is this an important one. It could easily appear on the midterm. And that's monoliths and lintels. It's on your handout of terms. The monoliths are the upright stones, and the lintels are the stones across the opening. That's all there is to it. They are that is a term to describe the construction method at Stonehenge. There we go. It's the first part of it. It's a single sentence.
How do you spell monolith?
It's on your handout. It's on your list of terms. I got to keep moving here. Monoliths and lintels. You see it there? It's number 4 on your list. No, 5. Sorry, 5. About halfway down the page. Monoliths and lintels is a term to describe the construction technique used at Stonehenge, in which the upright stones are monoliths and the cross stones, right, you could say horizontal if you prefer stones, are lintels. It's the oldest method of construction in the world. I'm sorry, did that person not have the list? If you didn't, I'll spell it for you. If you have the list of terms, you see it down there, right?
I
And
did the
just,
list.
yeah, I'm happy to answer usually, but we are running short on time because we haven't done the formal analysis. And then I want to tell you my little 2-minute anecdote about what not to do if you go to Stonehenge, and then stick around after that for those who have questions after we finish the notes on the slide. Okay, so formal analysis, these are cool gray stones, and there is no simulated texture. It's the real rough texture of the stone. So I'll pause while you write that. It's the first two elements. For space, it's real space, of course. So the inner circle of stones are 22 feet to the top. I gotta use this here. So the top of each lintel, or just say the top of the stones of the inner circle, are 22 feet high. That's real space. And the only other dimension you need to know is the middle circle, which is still, fairly consistent. I mean, there's about 2/3 of it left, or more than half. The inner circle, or sorry, middle circle, I misspoke. Those stones are 18 feet high. Anybody see the movie Spinal Tap? If you didn't, I won't. I love that scene where they make an 18-inch high model of this and then step on it with midgets running around it. Yeah. Anyway, so these are the real dimensions of real space. 18 feet from the ground to the top of the lintels on the middle circle, 22 feet for the inner circle. Obviously, those are real spaces. The largest mass, it's pretty easy. The inner circle of monoliths. The second largest mass, you can almost do the math, is the middle circle of monoliths. And then you can see where I'm going. The third largest mass is the inner circle of lintels. You can see how that works progressively. Now, these are worn down, but they once were all the way across the top, like here they are still. And the fourth largest, if you wanted to go to, you only have to define the first three largest masses. But here it's obvious what the next largest, there only are 4 sizes of stones, are the inner, I keep saying middle circle of lintels are the 4th largest mass. All right, and then we have modeling. It's just the shadows from the sun. It is both stable and dynamic because the upright stones and the lintels are, when they were complete, look how nearly flat these are, right? And the lintels. I'm going to show you my own slides from up close where you could actually walk through and touch them in just a minute when we finish up with that little 2-minute anecdote about what I had happened when I went there. But let's wrap up the formal analysis. Okay, and then we have the fact that it's arranged in circles. So each individual stone is stable. The arrangement is dynamic. So it's both. And when it was intact, it was completely symmetrical. Of course, by definition, circles are, including the outer circle. People stole these stones over centuries. The Romans stole some of them, and then the medieval farmers in England stole more. Some tourists stole them, though they've stopped that. You can't even get close to the stones anymore. I don't think that's happened since Elizabethan times. Yeah, in the 1500s, under Queen Elizabeth, there were people taking stones away from here. You can believe that late. Their own history. And they knew what this was, how unique it was. But there was no government control of historic sites in the 1500s. Starting in the 1800s, they protected it from desecration. So that's why so much of it is missing. So in other words, originally it was intact and of course completely symmetrical. Let's see. I think that covers everything, right? Mass modeling and line. There is only the visual line on the edges of the stone. So now let's go to my own views. Okay. When I was there the last time, I had a really good camera, but you couldn't get any closer to it. So I went back to my first visit with a camera when I was hitchhiking through England. I didn't have a camera. I was 20 years old. I could afford one. I slept on the ground here in a sleeping bag, and I snuck to the back of that outer circle, where it's almost all missing except for the heel stone, because I knew there was a ditch there. I'd studied it in art history at UC Berkeley, and I had to watch the sunrise over, not the heel stone, because this was in September. It wasn't the first day of summer, but just the experience of being there when the sun rose over Stonehenge. So I had a little travel alarm I kept with me in my, backpack and my sleeping bag, and I got away with it, but I almost didn't, because when I slept that night, no one saw me in that ditch until the next morning when these are my slides now. A British beefeater, if you know what that is, those are those heavy set guards. Only this guy wasn't dressed in red like the ones at the Tower of London, like the old style ones. This guy was dressed in a modern police uniform. He had a pistol and he had a club and he had mace. and he had a whistle. And that's how he woke me up. He stood about a foot over my face because I was sleeping, obviously, with my face facing upward. And just as the sun was about to rise, was the opening guard. He blew his whistle in my face, woke me up, and startled the heck out of me, and said, "What the bleeding," I can't repeat the 4-letter words he used, "are you doing here?" And as soon as I started to talk, he knew I was an American tourist. I said, I'm visiting from California." He goes, "You're a Yank, aren't you?" I said, "Yes." "So you Yanks, you don't seem to respect the rules. Didn't you see the sign on the entrance?" And of course I did, but I pretended I didn't. And I knew I was in trouble, so I couldn't think of anything to say except let's keep going and seeing these other views. "Well, sir, I apologize, but I studied this in college at Berkeley." And he said, "Berkeley? You can't even pronounce the word. It's Barclay." That's how they say the word Berkeley in England. So by the time I finished my little pathetic pleading, he had, softened, and he said, "I'll tell you what, I'm going to give you a break. I'm going to drag you." Of course, he grabbed me by the elbow and didn't give me any slack. And he dragged me with my sleeping bag across this site, because back then you could walk all around these stones, to the entrance gate, and pointed to the side on the entrance, inside and outside, both sides of the entrance gate. It said, "Trespassing is a violation of whatever ordinance it was, and violators will be prosecuted," and that's not my slide, of course, "punished with either a 1,500-pound fine." That was $3,000 back then. I think that's more money than I'd seen a whole summer I was in Europe. "Or 6 months in jail." Serious consequences. So at some point, I finally I prayed silently, and he said, "I'll let you go if you go back to Barclay, as you call it, and tell your Yank friends and fellow students, don't do what you did. If you come to Stonehenge, don't try to spend the night." So there you go. There's your little bit of lesson. Look how beautifully carved these are. The ones that are the best preserved. I mean, the edges here, even now after 4,000 years of very wet and cold weather in the winter in England, they're still pretty well preserved, some of them. Yeah, it's amazing. Yeah, this is what you could do when I think I took these on my third trip, which was actually my honeymoon, as I recall. And these are, a little bit slightly bluer than they actually looked, but not that far off, because it was like a cool, overcast, typical English weather in September. And there's where the heel stone would have, I'm sorry, this way, it would have hit, the sun would have risen over the heel stone and struck the tallest stone is in the middle there. Actually, it's funny, you didn't really notice it in those other pictures we were looking at when I was giving you the notes. And so you see how many stones have fallen over. But yeah, there we go. That's where the sun would have come up over the horizon the first day of summer every year for thousands of years, since before this place was built, but certainly since it was finished 4,000 years ago. And then it struck the largest stone or altar in the middle. Okay, that's it for tonight. I hope you all enjoyed it. We finished not too late. I'm sticking around to answer any questions you might have, okay, about anything we covered that isn't already obvious. Of course, if you missed something at the beginning, please look at the video, which will be posted by, certainly no later than 8 p.m. on YouTube under Mark Wilson's SRJC Art History Lectures, and of course, week 2, Prehistoric Art. Okay, any questions? Anybody have? Anyone?
No, good class.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for your questions and your comments. Yeah.
Hey, wait, I do have a question. When was the last time you were at Stonehenge?
In 2004, I went with a friend of mine who was going to major in art history. So we got permission to get closer than most tourists, but they would not let us walk through.
When was the last time you were able to just walk up to the stones? That's what.
Oh yeah, I can tell you about that honeymoon trip, 1985 was it? Or yeah, mid to late 80s. By 1990, there was already a rope that you weren't supposed to go past, and now it's even further out. They keep you about 20 feet away from the nearest.
Yeah, I was just curious because I was in London in
what year?
I think 89, and I had a chance to go there, but I was only in London for a couple days. And that was pretty much going to burn a whole day. Just
yes, it does, because it's about not quite 100 miles outside London.
Yeah, so I opted not to go, and I always kind of regretted that.
Well, you got to see it vicariously, at least.
Yeah, those were great pictures.
Thank you. Okay, anybody else have any questions? Because I'm going to sign off in a minute or two if there isn't any further. Of course, you can always email me during the week. And don't forget, next week we're going to talk about the papers, and you do want to print out the 2 PDFs. I'll send you one sample paper that will be an A paper from past class that you can print out and have with you if you want to, or just keep to look at when you write your own, plus a 1-page handout on the 5 requirements for your papers, and we'll go over those together before we get to ancient Babylon. We're going to cover next week. Okay, anyone else have any other questions? All right. These are my unofficial office hours. All right. So here we go. Then I'm going to sign off, and you'll see this posted, of course, on YouTube after 8 p.m. on Friday. And I'll see you all next Monday. All right. Good night. Take care.
Excuse me, sir. I just had a quick question.
Oh, sure. Go ahead.
Did you actually get the link I sent you through email?
I did. Are you talking about for extra credit? I think I'm double check.
Yeah,
What's
the
your
YouTube
name?
link.
Yeah. Give me your last name again, because
Cabrera, Cabrera.
yes, Tristan. Yes, I gave you 5 points.
Yeah.
I did, but my daughter
awesome.
had
Right,
done
thank you.
that too, and so I went ahead and I hope it worked. She said did it for me. She's in one of my other classes, not this one. How to forward it to everybody that's in all 3 of my art history classes. At least I hope so, because it doesn't always work as well for everybody. But the point is that it would give you. Now, Devin Ray, you have a question, right?
Yes, I did.
Yeah, right, sure.
I didn't want to answer it or ask it before because I didn't want to
Sure.
hold people from leaving. This has to do with books. So I've been able to find a copy of Art History by Marilyn Stockstad, but I've had almost no luck finding The Critic Sees by Sarah Gill.
Well, I know that is sometimes the case. I ordered it, but it's $80 at the store. They have it. They telling me they have it. They better not be lying. But that's $80. So you probably don't want to.
Looked at the.
Pardon me. You can find it for free online.
Really?
It's really commonly bootlegged.
Just
I think it's even on like torrent sites. Like it's if you do a little bit of Googling, it's super easy to find in PDF form. Yeah.
PDF form. Okay. And it's the whole text, not just part of it.
Well, last time I found it, yeah. You know.
When did you?
I was looking.
I did.
Bookstore to try to look for it.
Yes.
And
it was a while ago that
we got 2 people talking at the same time. Sorry, the person that's talking about the bookstore, tell me what you were going to say, just so I know I'm clear.
I had looked at I'm in Petaluma. I looked at the bookstore there and I hadn't found anything. And I'd also looked on the SRJC.
Oh, then they're lying to me. They sent me the museum bookstore. I wouldn't be shocked, but surprised that that's the case. They sent me an email saying that both textbooks and one of my classes, the Art 1.2, there's a third one I wrote that's required too, that they have them all. So now you got me thinking I got to kick some verbal butt or something, because it's not right. If they said they had them.
You should, because I looked at the website. No results came up for The Critic Sees. And when I looked for art history, for this class, it's supposed to be volume 2, and there was only volume 1 available.
Well, this class is volume 1. It is volume 1. This is ancient, so you don't want volume 2. That'd be a waste of your money. Yeah. But if you're saying volume 2 is still not available, none of my students in Art 1.2 have said that. They've bought it for Stockstead, but no one has. Yeah, I appreciate you bringing this up. Believe me, I'm not disputing or disagreeing with or whatever your comments. It's just upsetting to me, because last June I put in my request. Then I heard from a couple students about 8, 9, 10 days before semester started that they were having trouble finding them. So I got on the campus website for the bookstore. I called. I was put on hold 4 times, and they never called me back. And then finally, I emailed the manager twice, I think, and then she responded and said, "Yes, your book is available, but only through the Petaluma bookstore website." That's what she said. I have the email. So is that not true? She said both books. Sorry, Stockstead and.
I'm not gonna tell you that the lady was lying, because
I understand that. We don't want to say that. All I'm trying to find out is if there's any kind of disconnect or confusion or discrepancy. It's the first I've heard of it since before, because I communicated with them well before the first day of class. So you've got me warning me that I need to, definitely committed, I'll say committed to contacting them again. And I can't afford to spend 2 hours on the phone. What's wrong? They can't answer their phone, or at least not put you on hold for 15 or 20 minutes when you're an instructor trying to help your students. That turned me off, but I did persist, and they finally said, you're all good. Your 2 books for Art 2.1 and your 3 books for Art 1.2 are available. And I totally trust that you're telling me your experiences that they weren't. At least, when did you check? That is my last question. Then we should.
I checked 3 days ago.
Could be that they just didn't order enough. That could be.
And just to clarify real quick, because this is just me reading off of the syllabus, the part that says required text. This is Art 2.1, correct?
Right.
You wrote Volume 1 for Art 1.1 and Volume 2 for Art 1.2. And at the top.
Okay, that's a simple thing. I understand, but that's one of the few things where if I didn't concentrate on which class I teach at the top, and the books are the same and the subjects are the same between 1.1 and 2.1. The only difference is that with 1.1, it's world art, so you have a few other chapters to read, but the books are the same and the volumes are the same. I hope that helps. I understand what you're asking, and I didn't think that I had about a dozen tasks to take care of, plus which they weren't telling any of us about our in-person classes. I don't know if any of you know that. They were not giving any of us an answer about, students, you have dozens of students waiting, and they were saying they might cancel them up to the day before the classes start. So yeah, I was overwhelmed. And if that slipped through, mea culpa. Okay, I understand what you're saying. I probably should have caught that and added both 1.1 and 2.1. That
So
would have
for the
made it
people
clear.
in this
So
class,
I apologize. Sorry about that, but you can understand. I was swamped.
So when I'm looking for my book, I should be looking for Volume 1, not volume.
Only, yes.
Only Volume 1.
Because 1.2 has nothing to do with 2.1. The 2 totally different classes. They're described clearly in the course campus, website, as well as in my emails and in the art history department. So yeah, it's only Volume 1. You don't need Volume 2 for this class. You might, if you think you might take Art 1.2 or 2.3, the ones that cover Renaissance and modern art, then you might want to get that, but only if you know for sure you want to take one of those later. No, for this course or any of the ancient and medieval, all you need is Volume 1. Okay, I hope that helps. All right.
Those are my only questions. Thank you very much.
Well, yeah, thank you. I know it's important you brought it up, so you've got me thinking I better contact the student bookstore tomorrow and see what's going on. Okay. All right, everyone. Take care. Have a good evening.
Have a good one.
And I'll see you all next Monday. Yeah.
And then what was the homework for this week?
It's just to read this week.
Just
To
read? Okay, so
yeah, what's in the syllabus will say read chapters. There's 2 chapters in Stockstead and usually 2 in Gill each week. I'm sorry, this
Okay.
person here, you were able to find Gil, but you found it. Are you the one that said you found it bootleg?
no, but that's good to know about the bootleg. So I'll
But
go
have
look
you
for that one.
found Gil? Because Gil is available on used book websites. I've seen it on maybe it's A-books or e-books or I don't know. Yeah, we're not recording now, so you can go. Yeah. Oh, we still are.
Okay.
Let's stop the recording. Yeah. Anyway, good night to everybody, but I'll stick around to answer further questions, but I think we want to